In a plain with nothing but bushes, Kim Suho, or rather, Lloyd Frontera, observes with his pets and his loyal servant a vast sea of money. Digging his shovel into the ground, Lloyd activates his ability, turning that vast plain into a cluster of future buildings. This is the story of a civil engineer who completely changed the medieval world. But before that, let's go back a few years. You have been randomly chosen by the Absolute Being as a candidate. From now on, you will be a character in the novel. Knights of Blood and Iron. This was the message Kim Suho received as soon as he opened his eyes. Instantly, he realizes he has ended up in the fantasy world of the novel he read the night before but is confused because he woke up on the ground. He gets up, freezing, his mouth paralyzed from sleeping on the road. The system mocks him, leaving him stressed and making Lloyd try to hit it. Regaining consciousness, he knows he has possessed someone from the novel. But the only person who sleeps on the street and lives in the rural area is the young Master Lloyd. His bodyguard, who was searching everywhere, finally finds him. He is none other than the protagonist of the novel, Javier Azrahan. The protagonist recognizes him immediately, as he looks exactly like the illustrations in the novel. In the novel, Javier's reputation as a swordsman spread throughout the continent, but initially, he is just an anonymous knight who works in the countryside. When the protagonist finds out he is the vagabond Lloyd, he becomes extremely irritated. Seeing this, Javier says he never called him a vagabond, but is glad he has self-awareness. Back at his family's mansion, Javier is warming the fireplace, asking if Lloyd really can't remember what happened. Apparently, he drank until he was completely drunk, destroyed the bar, managed to get back home on pure instinct, but ended up fainting on the way. The protagonist, freezing, observes the ground. Although it's warm, the environment is still very cold, as expected in a fantasy medieval world. Before leaving, Javier says he will report the bar incident to Lloyd's father and is questioned by the protagonist about his family's debts. He knows the whole story from the novel, having read it in one night in his apartment. He also knows Lloyd's family's fate. The Baron and Baroness were killed by scammers, and vagabond Lloyd died vomiting blood. The protagonist is furious at how Lloyd has been living until now. It's even worse than his past life in Korea. The next day, his mother asks if he really destroyed things at the bar last night, and asks him to apologize to the owner this time. The protagonist thinks the body owner should apologize since he didn't do anything, but still says he will apologize. His words truly scare them both. They never imagined he would apologize to anyone. In the city, a man working with hay sees Lloyd and his guard walking through town, so scared of him that he hides behind the cart. In fact, this happens to everyone in town. Even children are instructed not to make eye contact with him. His mere presence disgusts the villagers, but this is something he already knows. He wonders why Javier is following him. Javier says the Lord asked him to prevent any accidents from happening again. In short, he's there to protect the villagers from Lloyd. The protagonist wonders if he should try to clean up his image first, but the more urgent matter is to make a lot of money to settle the family's debts so he can enjoy a good life. He checks the system for any hacks he can use, but only finds 2 useless abilities. Javier asks where Lloyd is going since they are already in front of the bar. The protagonist says he got distracted and didn't realize they had arrived, but Javier is still very suspicious of his actions and suspects he is lying. As the protagonist enters the bar, Javier thinks he's different from the night before, as if he's become someone else. Inside the bar, we see that Lloyd indeed caused a mess the night before. He apologizes, but it only puts the bar owner on high alert. Seeing that the bar owner is scared because he's speaking formally, he tries to be a bit more arrogant, but it seems his apology didn't work very well. Outside, Javier says it's normal for the bar owner not to accept his apologies, since he destroyed all his furniture and decorations that took so long to acquire. He says the bar owner will only be satisfied after receiving compensation, but the protagonist has several family debts to settle. Javier continues, saying the bar owner's mother's condition has worsened due to the winter cold, but this gives the protagonist a brilliant idea. As if a light bulb had finally lit up in his head, he remembers that there's no concept of heated stone slab floors here. If he could make one in this world, it would definitely sell well. This is something Lloyd could never do, but with Kim Suho's knowledge, it would be possible. In Korea, he studied civil engineering and even managed to build a house while in the army. Excited about the new idea, he tells Javier he'll go back to the bar, but as he's returning, he receives a notification from the system saying his real journey has begun, and now he had RP points to earn from people. At first, he doesn't quite understand what it means and imagines it must be similar to XP. However, unlike XP, he doesn't gain it by killing monsters but by improving his relationship with characters, so he takes the opportunity to test how it works on Javier. His impression level with him is at -30, finding this number very low. He tries to compliment him by saying he's handsome, but this only makes the impression even more unfavorable, now at -31. He decides to set this aside for now to avoid irritating him and proceeds to the bar. At the bar, Lloyd is trying to make a contract with the owner. The contract states that he will build something to pay for the cost of all the items he broke. The owner obviously becomes wary and suspicious of his actions, even using a mental barrier ability against the protagonist. Since his reputation is completely destroyed, he can't simply try to transform into someone else to redeem himself. Instead, he uses his reputation as a vagabond to make the bar owner sign the contract. Now with the contract in hand, Lloyd says it was an excellent choice to negotiate with him, while his bodyguard looks at him with suspicion of his actions. Outside in the bar's yard, he's measuring the site with a shovel. Javier asks if he's trying to establish a new pattern of misconduct, since he threatened the bar owner to sign the contract. The protagonist says he's judging him based on what he did in the past, but now things are different. He will make them smile in the end. He starts digging and thinks that the reason for their smiles will be the foundation of his future money. He begins digging a hole and flattening it, hitting it several times to make it smooth. Then he constructs the house structure using wood from the mansion's warehouse. A week later, the foundation of the house is almost ready. He just has to use the red clay by the river to create the exterior. However, he's not an inexhaustible machine. His body is still physically weak. Javier is truly impressed that he is keeping his part of the contract with the bar owner. Even though he's exhausted, the protagonist says he has no time to rest and continues his work. He prepares to cut the wood but is stopped by Javier, who takes the axe from his hand and asks what needs to be done. He tosses the wooden planks into the air and quickly cuts them into perfect shapes. The protagonist is impressed, giving him a thumbs up. This is expected from someone about to become a sword master, and he compares it to modern equipment. He boldly asks Javier to help him dig, which obviously annoys him since instead of thanking him, he's asking him to work more. But the protagonist convinces him, saying that if they finish quickly, he'll be able to satisfy his curiosity about what he's doing. With no other choice but to help him finish faster, Javier starts working with the protagonist, and shortly after, they complete the house. He questions him about the symbol on the plaque, but the protagonist says it's his logo. Then he calls him to check what kind of problem he caused, lighting the fireplace and calling the bar owner and his mother. Both seem to love the warm room. The old woman says she feels like her joints are loosening, while the bar owner wonders how he did it. The protagonist thinks it's normal for people in this world to be surprised by this. It's the power of the Andal floor technique, a Korean method for heating rooms. Javier is impressed, seeing that he really managed to make the two smile. Even though he still doubts Lloyd's intentions, it's undeniable that because of him, two people are happy. Javier's impressions of the protagonist increased by 2 points, earning him 36 RP points. The protagonist even jokes a bit with his bodyguard, saying he was probably thinking, how could trash like this think of that? Even though he spent a bit to build this house, it doesn't matter, as this model house will be the showcase of his new money source. A few days later, people were lining up to experience the sauna. Those coming out all sweaty only made those who hadn't entered yet more curious about it. The protagonist takes this opportunity to try to sell his idea. He created 2 different plans, Type A, which is a separate construction, and Type B, which remodels the existing house floor, also offering a 10% discount if they buy both constructions. While the protagonist is using his cunning to sell the contracts, his father appears, asking what he's doing. The protagonist becomes apprehensive when he sees him, and already in the mansion, they are having dinner facing each other at the table. It's not like he's avoiding him, but it would be problematic if he forbade him from working on the constructions. His father decides to listen to what he has to say and asks what he is plotting this time. He tries to act as Lloyd would and says that the only thing he did was build a heated room for the bar owner, although his father already knows about the contract he made with him and warns that lying and deceiving the population will not be tolerated. The protagonist says that's not what he's doing and asks to leave, but his father asks if he's worried about the family's situation. He continues to say not to worry, that he will overcome this situation immediately, and asks him not to stray from the right path. The protagonist remembers that in his past life, he also heard these words from his father. At the time, he thought everything was fine, but it was all a lie. As he leaves, he tells his father not to give up and to keep going strong. Those were the words he should have said to his father back then. While walking through the corridors thinking about the requests he received, 2 loan sharks pass by him without even greeting him. In the Baron's room, they say he has 5 days until the deadline, and if he continues not paying, they won't stand still. The protagonist, who was eavesdropping behind the door, thinks this is the perfect time to appear. He remembers receiving some RP when Javier's impression increased and found out he could use them to level up his skills. A sensor scans him completely, analyzing all the skills he possesses. The system says he's smarter than he seems, and the protagonist, angry, says it's obvious since he was a high-achieving scholarship student. The 2 skills he acquired based on his current knowledge were basic measurement and basic design. Even though he doesn't quite know what they mean, he buys both. Basic measurement is activated, and his eyes begin to glow green. As soon as he looks outside, he can calculate the land area simply with his eyes. The design skill creates a screen in front of him capable of drawing models quickly, much more useful than doing it on paper, for example. Even though the work will definitely become easier from now on, there's still a construction problem since he doesn't have enough manpower, and he thinks that having a backhoe or heavy machine would make things much easier. The system says it's possible to summon one, making the protagonist quite excited, but it costs 50 RP to summon a random fantasy species, and he only has one. Still, that's great since if fantasy species are as he imagines, they will probably be more useful than heavy machines. Back to the loan sharks. They are threatening the Baron that if he doesn't have enough money to pay, they might end up taking his wife and maid to be sold. However, at that moment, the protagonist arrives, asking if they have no manners just because they are loan sharks. They ask why a child is interfering in adult conversations, but before they ask him to leave, the protagonist asks for their invitation letter. In the kingdom's noble law, in Article 3, Section 6, it says that all nobles have the right to protect their rights and interests, and entering a noble's mansion without an invitation is equivalent to invasion. The loan sharks say they've never heard of this law, but he tells them to check it together and calls Javier. As soon as he enters the room, the protagonist orders to cut off the invader's arms. The loan sharks ask if he's crazy and if he plans to resolve this in court. Then he says that's why he told them to check together. He wants to see which side the court will take. Seeing Javier unsheath his sword, the 2 loan sharks get scared and flee, saying they will regret this. His father questions him scared, saying this won't help calm the situation, until Lloyd throws a bag of money on his table. He says that's the initial payment he received and that it's a considerable amount for this month. His father thinks he's extorting money from people, but Javier tells him not to worry since he's monitoring the young master to keep his promise. Seeing that Javier trusts his son, he allows himself to trust him this time. In the corridors, Javier asks how he knows about the law, as he always thought he was an ignorant person, but the protagonist, angry, replies that he found it around. In fact, he found it in the novel. After the couple's death, the loan sharks wanted to dig and take the bodies to sell. At that moment, Javier talks about the law and cuts off the heads of the 2, knowing the novel's content is beneficial, but in any case, one message catches his attention now. He gains 60 RP as his father's trust increased. He goes to a secluded area away from people and activates the random spin. Several gears start floating in the air, forming a magic circle, but it's smaller than he imagined. From this circle, a small mouse comes out, falling to the ground. Seeing that tiny mouse, the protagonist thinks his summoning was a failure, making the poor mouse cry. It manages to communicate, saying that it's not a failure and can do many things. The protagonist asks what it can do, so it spits out a manual. Despite finding it grosses, the protagonist takes the drool-covered manual and discovers that besides being cute, they can have their constitution altered by feeding them sunflower seeds. Red seeds make them giant for 12 hours, while blue ones make them small. He asks if it can become as big as a human, since hamsters are good diggers. If it were human-sized, it would be really useful. When he feeds it, the hamster starts glowing and growing. It grows so much and so quickly that it ends up colliding with the protagonist, throwing him a bit away. The hamster, which could fit in his palm before, must now be over 10 meters tall. Besides, it has the digging ability, able to quickly dig through the ground. It can also harden the ground by rolling over it, and can store plenty of things in its mouth. The protagonist is happy because the heavy machinery problem is solved, but he can't just show up with these giant creatures since people might get suspicious. So, he will carry a book with him all the time and claim to be a summoning genius. The next day, Lloyd is instructing the workers with his slogans. He makes everyone repeat with him. Safety first. The army of 30 people is clearly demotivated for work, even though they are still paid even if they don't work. The protagonist wonders why the Baron didn't fire them before, but this works better for him since there won't be additional labor costs. To try to motivate them, the protagonist gives a motivational speech, pointing at a handful of dirt, saying he spent the night digging it up and they should take it to the constructions. In reality, it was Podong who did it in 30 minutes. But even with a speech, they are still not motivated at all. He even thinks it's a normal reaction since people don't like to work. Then he is interrupted by the senior knight Nauman, who asks what he just ordered his troops to do. This man appearing there was something he expected. There are 3 knights living on this property, Newman, Bayern, and Javier. In the beginning of the novel, Bayern and Javier remained loyal until the property collapsed. But this man in front of him was the first to betray the Baron. Lloyd asks what he's doing, and he says he can't believe he's giving his soldiers dirty work, and as the head of the knights, he can't accept that. The protagonist says he got approval from the Lord, but he insists on talking about the past and that the protagonist must be using the soldiers for personal purposes. Lloyd asks if he wants a beating, and just with that, the guy gets quite stressed. He then makes the first move by throwing sand in his face. Everyone who sees that is shocked, while the guard asks if he really just tried to tarnish his reputation as a knight. The protagonist pretends he didn't hear what he said, then challenges him to a duel right away. Returning to the mansion, Javier asks if he has confidence in defeating Newman. His opponent has a mana heart, and is also known as a sword specialist, while the protagonist is just a wretch. How could he even think of winning against him? Javier gets irritated with Lloyd teasing him, almost cutting him with his sword. He tries to analyze his actions, but everything he is doing is very strange. After picking his nose, he asks Javier to teach him swordsmanship. Javier says he would never teach his swordsmanship to someone like him, as someone with bad character like him could use it against people around him. The protagonist knew he wouldn't teach his swordsmanship right away, so he proposes to cure his insomnia. Javier wonders how he knows that, as if he's answering him in his head. The protagonist says he read it in the novel. In the novel, the ranking of the knights is divided into 4 levels. Javier's level is expert swordsman, and he will soon rise to the highest level, master swordsman. And the reason he can't sleep is that his nerves are superhuman. He agrees to the contract with Lloyd, but he will only teach swordsmanship if he can make him sleep, and says that he has already tried several ways to cure his insomnia, from cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatic therapy. Even after saying all that, in a few minutes, he was already sleeping like a baby, hugging his pillow. The method the protagonist used to make him sleep is the same as teachers do in the classroom. He talked so much that at some point he just fell asleep. Now that he has fulfilled his part of the deal, all his sword techniques will be his. The next day, Javier, now refreshed from having a good night's sleep, tells the protagonist to start training with 50 laps. And surprisingly, he starts running without complaining. He completes 1 lap and says he hates doing it, but by the 2nd lap, he totally changes and says he surely didn't expect him to do it without complaining. By the 3rd lap, he unmasks his plan, saying he would say something like, "You don't have talent for this," and ignore the training. While he's being totally annoying to Javier, he gains a skill that asks him to hit himself, but he tells the system to discard it. It would be a lie to say he's not tired, but this is nothing compared to his past life. He had no family and woke up alone every day. At work, he carried bricks up to the 4th floor of a building every day, and at night, he unloaded trucks. All this just to survive, hoping that one day it would get better. Compared to that pain and despair, this is nothing. Seeing that determination and sincerity, Javier decides to teach him his sword technique. In the mansion, Newman talks to the Baron. He is disappointed that his son dared to insult someone who has protected his family for so long. He had hoped that he was becoming more rational, but it seems he was mistaken. He says it's his duty not to cancel the duel but asks him not to hurt him so much since he's still the heir to the estate. Newman says he accepts his request, but his true intentions are entirely different. He plans to kill him in the fight, and if the Baron complains, he will kill him and his wife and make it look like suicide, all as he had planned. 1 month later, the long-awaited battle begins. The Baron and the Baroness, with their servants, watch anxiously. Newman asks if the protagonist is prepared. He, carrying only a shovel, says he should be prepared to take a beating. Everyone watching the fight from outside wonders if he's really going to fight with a shovel. Javier says he personally asked the blacksmith to forge it. His father is deeply disappointed, thinking he's playing around with a serious situation. But Javier, who has been following what he's been doing for the past month, doubts that he's just fooling around. Early in the morning, he did the basic training without complaining. Then he went to the construction area to teach the residents about Andal, and then practiced swordsmanship until falling asleep at night. Someone who dedicated himself so much for a month couldn't be just fooling around. Javier is sure he's taking the fight seriously. The Baron initiates the duel between them, and the protagonist starts the combat with a pretty mediocre stance. Newman, who was already pissed off with him, is the first to attack but has his first attack defended. Both his father and Javier are impressed that he managed to defend an attack, and it wasn't just luck, since he continues to defend all the subsequent attacks. Javier is impressed with the extraordinary efficiency of his movements. It's like a sword technique evolved over many years. In fact, it's called modern combat, bayonet charge, something every Korean man learns in the army. Even using the shovel as a weapon wasn't random, since in addition to being able to use the shovel to defend himself, he can also use it to attack. For this combat, the protagonist came 100% prepared, first preparing the shovel, second, the basic sword technique, and finally, a tool synchronization ability for excavation. He managed to buy this ability thanks to Javier and his parents. Then, Newman shows why he is a Baron's Knight. He starts accelerating the state of his own mana using his mana heart. He truly prepares to attack this time, advancing almost instantly towards the protagonist. Even Javier says it's impossible for an ordinary person to block an attack from someone who has a mana heart. That's if he were an ordinary person, of course. Even though he attacked with all his strength, aiming to kill, the protagonist manages to block the sword. Newman is confused, feeling as if his body had sunk. This was the fourth ability he prepared, Azrahan's core technique, the technique that made Javier the strongest man in the novel. He realizes that his attack's mana was absorbed, immediately pulling out his sword, but the protagonist takes advantage of this opening to land a blow on his face. The impact is so great that he sees one of his teeth flying, and then he is hit by another attack. Everyone around is shocked. Lloyd really managed to win. His father ends the duel, but this isn't enough to quench Lloyd's anger. He continues to beat him while he's on the ground. His father gets angry, telling him to stop trying to tarnish the knight's honor. As some of the soldiers try to stop him, saying that the duel is over, the other knight from the family remarks that he's out of control. Lloyd claims to have calmed down and asks the soldiers to release him, only to hit him again immediately afterward. Javier, who is observing more closely, notices that he's hitting only in places that would cause almost no wounds, and the calm expression on his face indicates that he already knew this would happen. 15 days before the duel, the protagonist came asking him to teach the mental technique Azrahan. This startles Javier, since this technique was created by him, and supposedly no one else should know it. He confirms if this technique can attract mana from the surroundings and convert it into one's own. Javier asks how he knows the technique, but the protagonist shamelessly lies, saying he talked about it in his sleep. Javier says he can't teach the technique because it's still incomplete, but the protagonist claims he can complete it. He explains that if he absorbs external mana and puts it in the mana heart, the mana heart will simply reject it and explode it out, as they don't mix. He should concentrate it separately, and then move it around the mana heart. Javier thinks this might really be possible and asks how he came up with it, but the protagonist continues to brazenly say he just imagined it would work. That day, Javier was able to complete the technique he had been worrying about for so long, and on the first try, he managed to create 3 circles. Lloyd says he doesn't want to create a mana heart. All he wants to learn is the absorption part. He just wants to absorb what he can touch. Since he had learned this ability, Javier thought he could defeat Newman, but he triumphantly won. His father again tells him to stop talking about his reputation as a knight, but he tells him to look under the tablecloth and then say if this man deserves to be called a knight. He finds several letters, and when he reads their contents, everything is there. From the property's situation to the Baron's likes and dislikes and instructions on how to forge fake documents. These letters contain everything he has shared so far. Newman wonders how he found them since he had hidden them inside the wall, but due to the novel, he already knew where they were and sent his hamster to fetch them. He sees that his father is completely shocked. In the novel, he was described as a kind man, but this protagonist doesn't know the words kind and friendly. He suggests a way to get rid of this man. He proposes throwing fierce rats on his head and then banishing him from the properties or reducing him to a normal knight and giving him a chance to think about his sins. People are confused about why he wants to throw rats at him, since a measly rat wouldn't be able to hurt Newman. Both his father and the people around think it's a sensible and generous suggestion, albeit understandably dangerous. His father agrees to the punishment and asks if Newman has any objections to it. He obviously doesn't, and thanks for their mercy. If you treat an evildoer well, will they really reflect on their sins and return the given mercy? Or will they become even more determined to manipulate and figure out how to take advantage of that kindness? The protagonist says it's great to see his final smile, gives a red sunflower seed for his pet to eat, and says there's no best method to ask for forgiveness. The rat thrown into the air grows to a colossal size, falling on top of Newman, probably killing him. With this, the rotten apple of his lands has just fallen. The next day, his hamster digs a path in the middle of the city. Javier asks what he's doing, and Lloyd replies that he's preparing the way to build a road. The engineering unit, previously shy and unwilling to work, has now become surprisingly efficient. He mentions that in ancient times there was a city called Rome, where people loved roads and even created a road system called the Appian Way. He wants to build something similar, a road that stretches from the Baron's house to the eastern coast. Javier questions again why he's building a road, but the protagonist tells him to just watch quietly and see the rising popularity of roads. However, everything seems very strange to Javier, so he asks where he suddenly learned to do all this. He asks if he's really his young master Lloyd. When the protagonist saw this guy's personality in the novel, he knew something like this could happen. He's the kind of person who would notice the change and immediately draw his sword. He starts using his Lloyd persona, claiming he studied without anyone knowing, and when questioned, since he only lived on alcohol, he says that Javier didn't watch him all day and couldn't know if he was studying or not. He asks how he explains the summoning, as it would be difficult for mages even with 20 years of experience. So the protagonist retorts by asking how he manages to use mana so well at 20 years old, and says that if he's a genius, why couldn't he be one too? Unable to refute his words, Javier just stays silent, so the protagonist seizes the moment to flee and get out of there as fast as possible. He goes to Knight Bayer and asks him to take care of everything while he's away. Javier says he'll accompany him, as it's his duty to watch over the young master, but the protagonist questions why he's stating something so obvious. Javier asks where they are going, and he replies that they are going to a distant place to collect unpaid debts. In a small, remote town in the Runia property, the scammer from Thor to Real Estate is very stressed because he lost a lot of money. His bodyguard says it's normal since he makes money by gambling, and also says that if he doesn't have enough money to pay him, he'll have to leave. The scammer gets scared, saying he can still pay and that he shouldn't go anywhere. He can make money by cheating others again, but since many people are looking for him, it's better to lay low for now. At that moment, the protagonist kicks the bar door open. The man asks what's wrong with him, but when the protagonist introduces himself as Lloyd Frontera, the guy is shocked as if seeing a ghost. The scammer immediately tells his bodyguard to run with him, and with just one leap, he jumps through the bar window. However, when he reaches the alley, a man is already waiting for him. Javier orders him to surrender the scammer and leave. If he refuses, he will be considered an accomplice. The bodyguard won't give up so easily, and as he prepares a spell, he asks if he even knows how to use a sword. The protagonist, observing the fight through the broken window, says that when Javier lost the Baron, he sought revenge and then fought this bodyguard, the first evil black mage he encountered. He had to fight against gravity power. At least that's how it is in the novel. The black mage then uses his gravity magic, directing it towards Javier. He manages to defend using his sword, but the magic expands and creates a gravitational field around him. The black mage then activates the gravity, causing him to break the ground with his feet. When Javier fought this guy in the novel, he was just an expert swordsman, but now this Javier has 3 mana circles and easily manages to cut the gravity magic. Seeing that it will be impossible to confront him directly, the black mage flees, saying that wasn't part of the contract. Javier asks if he knows what happens if he strikes a noble, intending to cut his legs, so he will crawl to the tribunal. However, at the last second, the scammer is saved by Lloyd, who steps in the middle of the attack and prevents it from landing. He shouts at Javier, saying he will be punished with death if he goes to the tribunal. Javier is shocked. Lloyd just showed kindness to another person. They tie up and lock the swindler in the room. Seeing him quite apprehensive, the protagonist tells him not to be so afraid since he won't kill him. After all, if he did, the people he owes money to would cause a mess. The swindler asks if the protagonist will forgive him, and Lloyd replies that he won't take it to the tribunal, but he expects compensation in money. But since he doesn't have money to pay, the protagonist has another way to forgive him. All he has to do is sign this contract, and that's it. The swindler asks what kind of contract it is. It's just an ordinary worker's contract, and he will be paid, of course, but 80% of his salary will go to repayments due to the high debt, to be paid after 520 years. This shocks both the swindler and Javier. It was obvious that he wasn't there just to sympathize and forgive. The protagonist thinks he'd never be crazy enough to kill a guy who owes him. He'll suck every drop of money he can for the rest of his life. The swindler asks how he can make such an unfair contract, but when the protagonist threatens to take it to the tribunal, he ends up signing the contract right away. Back in the cart on the way to town, we see the swindler still tied up. Javier mentions that due to this guy's money, they won't have to worry about interest for a few months. However, the protagonist corrects him, saying he'll use all that money to invest in labor costs since the 30 soldiers aren't enough. A few days later, we see the protagonist recruiting employees. The line is so long that it extends for several meters. He asks Javier if these people really hate him. He's sure they do, but due to selling the Diendal for a lower price and being firm in punishing the traitor, people have started to see him as trustworthy and capable. The man in front of him asks where to sign the contract but thanks him first since his son used to get very cold in winter. But thanks to him, he doesn't have to worry about that this year. The protagonist even feels ashamed, as he's only satisfying his greed. The man continues, saying he has relatives from another town who would like to buy the Andals. The protagonist expected this to happen, since he didn't build the Andal for nothing. Now he'll raise the price under the pretext of travel expenses and make all the money from them. Up in the mountains, Lloyd tells Javier that one day this mountain will be entirely bare because the Andal consumes a lot of resources. The trees here won't last long. That's why he's canceling the construction of the Appian Way. At the end of the road, there's a reserve of bituminous coal. They'll extract and sell it for a high price. If the Andal gains a high level of approval, other countries won't be able to resist. Of course, the people in their town will get a discount, but just a little. Lloyd asks if he finds this unfair, but he says if he doesn't do it, he won't be able to pay off the family's debts. Javier agrees with this, but mining there is impossible as it already collapsed once. Still, he says he can do it because he knows modern-era excavation technology. He will use the shield method. Javier has no idea what this shield method means but says he'll continue to observe this completely different young master. However, even the protagonist who read the novel doesn't know everything. In this world, there are hidden dangers, and within the cave are thousands of creatures just waiting to emerge. Lloyd clasps his hands and performs magic, casting it upward and summoning a high-level apartment. A huge building appears from the sky, falling behind him. At least that's what he would like to do, but the only magic he uses is on his finger to design faster. Tired because this project is taking too long, he thinks he would like to summon 100 undead workers who don't need a salary. Due to the incident with Newman, he gains 639 reputation points due to favorable impressions from people. He upgraded his basic design skills and basic measurement skills to intermediate level, gaining new functions. Arriving at the mine entrance, he reflects on how he's supposed to dig there. He activates his intermediate measurement skill and can scan up to 5 meters. With this ability, he can find the safest path, but the problem is how to unearth the entrance quickly. Humans will take too long and get tired easily, and Padong is sick of the road project. He sees no other choice but to randomly draw a new species. He activates the mini portal again, which makes quite a noise, and a mini snake comes out of it. Seeing this cute snake, it seems apparently useless on the outside, but he remembers that was the case with Padong too, and asks if it grows big with sunflower seeds. He asks her to demonstrate her skills, and weeks later, he sees that she is much more useful than he imagined. She can eat the earth in front of the shield equipment, then she digests the food, and at that moment, Javier prepares for the attacks. She excretes steel, and Javier is in charge of cutting them, which are then used to build the terrain's support structure. Javier questions why he's cutting the poop of a giant snake, but the protagonist doesn't care and orders everyone to move forward, pushing the iron shield. Even though he installed oxygen tubes, he still feels a bit dizzy, but if it weren't for them, he would have probably passed out inside. Seeing that he's starting to get tired, Javier tells him that he also needs to rest with the other workers, but the protagonist says he's the site manager and needs to oversee the operation and act responsibly. In Korea, the people in charge of the work were the kind of people who didn't even show up on site. He hated those people and promises never to be like them. So, he uses his ability and detects luminous coal ahead. He cheers everyone up, saying they're almost there, and thanks to Little Snake because thanks to her, they were able to do this 10 times faster. While the protagonist explains that after they reach the coal, they'll have to dismantle the shields and expand the space, they start hearing a noise coming from the ground. Alarmed, the protagonist uses his ability and sees a small hole that wasn't there before, and this hole begins to grow larger until a giant ant emerges from it. Javier immediately cuts its antennae, and Lloyd uses his shovel to crush its head. The sudden appearance of this monster surprised him since it's something that didn't appear in the novel. But this is not the time to relax because an ant never walks alone. Thousands of ants begin to appear, and the protagonist evacuates everyone outside, while Javier manages to hold several of them, cutting them into pieces. If there's an ant colony, there can be from 200 to 1,000 monsters there. Javier is running out of breath. He won't be able to hold them all, and the path they made is so well structured that it won't collapse unless they use dynamite. The situation seems very complicated, so Javier slaps Lloyd's face to snap him out of it and not panic. Who is thinking incessantly for a solution, comes up with another brilliant idea. He tells Javier that they will attack head-on and enter the ant tunnel, even though he thinks it's absurd. There must be some reason behind it, so they proceed. At the mansion, the Baron receives the news that monsters have invaded the mine and that his son and Javier stayed behind. He quickly puts on his armor set and tells them to go immediately to the mine. Meanwhile, Javier continues fighting the ants and asks how much more they have to face. The two are completely surrounded by the ants. The protagonist knows that Javier is reaching his limit. He uses his ability to locate methane gas somewhere underground, knowing that if they can find it, they can create a large-scale explosion to deal with the ants. He manages to locate it and starts digging to unearth the methane gas, with Javier protecting him. Things seem to be going well, but they both hear a very loud scream. The Ant Queen has decided to show up, and just by seeing her size, Javier says he can't face her. However, in this situation, he has no choice but to push beyond his limits, managing to defend against and counterattack the Queen's assault. While Javier fights her, the protagonist continues digging until he finally uncovers the gas. He tells Javier to get out of there as fast as possible and run to the entrance, while he grabs a still-burning torch. They run through the tunnel filled with dead ant bodies, and when they finally put enough distance, he throws the flaming torch towards the gas outlet. The Ant Queen tries to attack them but is hit by the massive explosion caused by the gas. Not only her, but all the ants in the cave are caught in the blast. Outside, people hear the noise and a great tremor from deep inside the cave. The Baron worries about his son and tries to enter the cave but is stopped by his bodyguard. Inside, the two survive the explosion, but Javier and the snake have fainted. To make matters worse, the entrance is blocked. Realizing they will soon run out of oxygen, the protagonist uses his ability to see through the wall. He sees no other option but to start digging. Javier, who managed to keep some consciousness, sees him working to get them out, and as a result, he builds a stronger bond with him. Seeing that he has nothing more to lose, he asks the system to enhance his abilities. The system reanalyzes the abilities he possesses, combining all these skills to create the core technique Azrahan. When the ability is created, he feels immense power coursing through his body. Even though he doesn't have a mana core, he can feel the mana circulating around his core. His mana increase went up to 120%, and now he has plenty of RP to spend, so he keeps increasing it until his technique reaches level 10. When it reaches level 10, it evolves, and he starts feeling 2 mana circles circulating around his heart. Now his mana increase is at 200%, and he also gains 2 new abilities, one that prevents fatigue for 10 minutes, and another that triples his mana for 20 minutes. He activates his fatigue preventing ability, and begins digging tirelessly towards the exit. After digging deep into the excavation, he finally sees a hole indicating the way out, but he is still 5 meters away. He doesn't give up and keeps digging until he reaches 3 meters away, but his oxygen runs out, and he falls to his knees, exhausted. Then he activates his other ability, Power Extension, and continues to hold on firmly to the excavation, but its limit is 20 seconds, which is not enough time for him to reach the exit. Already feeling hopeless, he thinks that as the son of a noble in a remote area, he just wanted to live a quiet life. Unfortunately, he is about to die after exerting so much effort. When he was about to accept his fate, Padong appears, making a small hole. This small hole is enough for him to breathe and regain his strength. Even though he is tired, he still gets up, clinging to the hope that a peaceful life as a noble awaits him just ahead. Inside the cave, the Baron's group explores it, even the deep parts, in search of the two, until he sees his son carrying Javier on his back, who surpassed the limits of his own body, was able to create a third ability that allowed him to endure until there. Seeing that he has finally achieved his goal, the protagonist faints, being embraced by his father. The next day, people in the city talk about what happened. Those who thought Lloyd was just a spoiled brat are impressed by his determination and courage to stay there, fighting against the ants and rescuing all the workers. Back in his room, Lloyd sleeps under Javier's watchful eye. As soon as he opens his eyes, the system's message saying that people are impressed with his courage and heroism appears in front of him. He quickly becomes a hero and gains 500 RP for it, which makes him very happy, of course. The next day, the workers are even more motivated in mining, and when they see Lloyd arriving, everyone starts greeting him and thanking him for saving them. They now see him as the person who saved their lives and think he's different from other nobles. 2 weeks have passed since the incident, and even though nothing has happened, the protagonist still decides to prioritize safety and conduct sweeps around the mine. Javier asks why he's personally doing these dangerous things when he could just send one of the workers. But the protagonist calls him an idiot. He should be responsible for the dangerous tasks, so they won't say anything even if he spends a lot of money. They reach the end of the tunnel, and Javier tells them to go back. But the protagonist seems to have seen something with his ability. He starts digging to investigate, as there might be ant eggs that haven't hatched yet. But what he finds is something unexpected. An orc trapped along with several other animals, probably stored to be eaten later. Javier says he looks dangerous and intends to take care of him right away, but he's stopped by the protagonist. Lloyd asks if he's dead, but Javier says ants have a habit of only paralyzing what they're going to eat. The MC gives a wicked smile and says this is an incredible reward. Back at the mansion, the orc is already awake. His name is Hirosh, and he says he will never forget him as his savior. Hirosh, the son of the orc tribe leader, says he will do anything for Lloyd for being his savior. In fact, that was the exact reason he helped the Green One. Our prota asks for 120 orc workers to help at the mine, but his request is denied by the orc. As orcs are warriors, only other warriors can give them orders. And since young Lloyd is not a warrior, he couldn't give orders to the orcs even if they provided workers. In the orc tribe, it's necessary to bring the head of a monster ant when one becomes an adult. Hirosh made a mistake in the tunnel and ended up being paralyzed. But of course, our MC wouldn't let this opportunity pass so easily. Before anything else, he congratulates him for becoming an adult orc. Hirosh, crestfallen, says he couldn't catch a monster ant, so the protagonist says they caught the ant queen together, showing her head pinned to the wall. The Hulk says he doesn't remember catching such a big ant, but the liar says it was a truly surprising sight because when he entered the ant tunnel, the queen was trembling with fear. While Javier listens to his disgusting lie, The orc believes that they are both excellent warriors and that they together caught the queen. Lloyd mentions the 120 workers again, but this time the orc says he will recruit them. A week later, in the Steel Sand Tribe village, the protagonist, who had made a long trip there, finds out that the orc leader refuses his request. Shocked, he asks why. The orc chief says they need to hunt every day, and if they don't eat protein right after the hunt, they will lose muscle strength. Javier says these orcs are bodybuilding maniacs, so it will be impossible to convince them. The protagonist asks if there was a way to preserve the meat so they could go without hunting for more than 3 days, and he says he knows how to prevent the meat from spoiling even after several days. Let's go back a little in time to remember the moment they arrived in the village. The father and son, who hadn't seen each other for so many days, were extremely emotional to see each other again. They run to each other and give a tight hug. The impact of the hug alone was so strong that it caused a gust of wind to spread around. Lloyd says that if anyone had been between those two, they would have turned into mincemeat. Our mercenary thinks that if they can get 120 workers with these two, productivity will increase hundreds of times. But that wasn't the only thing that caught his attention. When Hirosh brought the Ant Queen's head as a celebration, the orcs were using massive gold objects for squats. Lloyd is shocked and wonders where they found those. It's as if they stole or took them from somewhere. Because of this, he makes a deal with the orc tribe leader to get both the labor force and the treasures. Javier is reading the contract and discovers that they will build a stone-cold storage warehouse. Not knowing what that means, he asks Lloyd. The royal family preserves food using ice magic. What they are going to do is similar, but they won't use magic. To make it, they will need a special stone called granite. It is a very resistant stone and will be difficult to extract. Normally, one would use dynamite to extract the stones, but right next to him is a human dynamo. From Javier's look, he already knows he will use him again. In one of the main episodes of the story, in the city of Namrum, the entire population was trapped in a magic barrier, and within this city were thousands of refugees that Javier needed to save. At this moment, Javier was a sword master with 4 cores spinning around his mana heart. At this moment of despair, he unintentionally created a skill. The explosion from the collision was so strong that, aside from destroying the magic barrier, it became one of his main techniques. Lloyd explains this technique that he could use. Javier again asks how he knows about this, but the protagonist says he just thought of it at some point. Even though the real reason he taught him this technique was to use him, it would still be a great strength boost if he could execute it. Protecting the mana heart with 1 core and moving the other 3, he releases an explosion into the rock. It was so strong that it tore through all his clothes and even ruffled his hair. Angry, Javier asks if he knew that would happen, but Lloyd says he had no idea and apologizes. Anyway, the idea worked. Now it's his turn to work. Javier speaks of his knight's honor, and that now he's being used for construction, but the MC realizes that this is just his way of showing gratitude. After this, the construction proceeded rapidly. The granite Javier cut was carried by Padang. The orcs who were addicted to training started working on their own. Because of this help, they will be able to finish 5 times faster, and the last thing they will need is the ice and thermal insulation. Lloyd asks Javier where the people with the insulating material are. He replies that it's been exactly 3 weeks, and the group should have arrived by now. There are 2 possibilities. Either the soldiers are lazy, or there was an accident. The protagonist says they must check immediately. Javier stops him and says that if this is a mission, he should do it alone since he doesn't know what kind of accident happened. It could be dangerous. But Lloyd has explained this several times. He is in charge of construction and responsible for the workers' lives. Exploring further into the mountains, he ends up finding one of the gloves he had custom made to use when handling insulating materials. Javier warns that he senses a strange energy coming toward the canyon, an abnormal flow of mana but very faint. Thinking about it, he tries to remember if he saw something similar in any of the novel's episodes, but something leaves him completely terrified. He immediately says there's no time, and they need to walk quickly, as everyone might be dead. They venture further into the canyon, finding several clues from the missing group, until they reach Rupalan's dungeon. This was a place Javier had been looking for since the beginning of the novel, the hideout of a black mage named Rupalan. The protagonist is deeply irritated that someone dared to lay hands on his workers. Javier is the first to enter the cave, telling Lloyd to stay behind him. He ends up stepping into a trap but is narrowly saved by the protagonist. MC asks if he's sure he's a knight. He should have thought that there might be a trap inside. In fact, he already knew about the existence of this trap since in the novel, Javier fell into it and had to continue through the dungeon all battered. But Javier is the type of person who never falls for the same trick twice. Lloyd comments that earlier, he felt a normal mana flow and asks him to use that technique since magical traps are linked to mana. He would be able to sense any abnormalities. Javier manages to detect where the traps are located and begins to guide the way to the back of the cave. The swordsman thinks that even though his master always lies or insists on annoying things, this time it seems like he knows exactly what's going on. He can't sense any special mana or energy, and thinks it might be a type of very powerful mana, but he decides to ignore that and focus on rescuing the workers. Inside the cave, a black mage senses the presence of intruders since one of the traps was activated. They probably came to rescue the recently kidnapped people. However, the black mage has already finished the preparations he needed to make and approaches a large iron door. Opening it, the 5 missing workers are there. He grabs one of them by the hair and starts dragging him, throwing him into a magic circle of blood. This is the magic circle that connects to hell. Using a scythe bathed in blood for 100 days and a young human, he will execute his spell. Before he can hit him, the black mage hears a shout telling him to stop. At the entrance to the laboratory, he sees Lloyd and Javier ready to attack him. Surprised at how fast they got there since there were hundreds of traps in the cave, the mage automatically uses one of his spells. 2 iron doors close around them, trapping them in that small space. The protagonist already knows what's coming and holds his breath as a sleep-inducing gas starts to fill the area. Lloyd uses his ability that makes him tireless for 10 minutes and starts digging quickly into the ground to make a tunnel. He doesn't need to worry about Javier since he is already immune to all medications to treat his insomnia, so sleeping pills don't work on him. Seeing Lloyd digging a hole under the door, he looks like a giant mole. Javier will keep that memory to tease him later. When the MC finishes digging the hole, he calls Xavier to finish it, preparing a magical explosion to surprise the black mage. The big explosion works, and the black mage is totally shocked to see that. Observing the protagonist emerge from the hole in a monstrous way, he decides to summon a creature to fight. A 2-headed monster comes out of the circle. Even though it's one of his failures, this monster is still very strong. Seeing this giant creature in front of him, Lloyd tries to tell Javier its weak point, but using the explosive wave, he manages to make a cut that tears the monster in half. Even the MC is impressed, since he didn't know he could use the explosion as a propeller to cut. This is a technique that doesn't even exist in the novel. Seeing the swordsman easily deal with his monster, the black mage goes into despair as he can't defeat them. The protagonist approaches him and asks how he intends to compensate for delaying the construction by 2 weeks due to the soldier's abduction. The black mage kneels, begging for forgiveness. In his mind, all he thinks about is surviving, but the protagonist doesn't care about the apology and asks about the compensation. With no alternatives, the black mage offers all his magical items. Lloyd is quite pleased that all the items will be his, while Javier rescues the soldiers. The MC asks what he was going to do with the kidnapped soldiers. The black mage was studying the resurrection of the dead, trying to bring back his deceased wife and son. He worked as a mage in the Lord's mansion, but one day the Lord tried to take them away from him, so the black mage planned to escape with his family. Lloyd interrupts his story right in the middle. He is not interested in hearing it at all. The protagonist asks if the black mage really thinks that bringing back his wife and daughter after killing hundreds of people will be good. Due to his selfish goal, he ruined several other happy families. He can only be judged as a serial killer after doing that. Lloyd says he will come back later to take the magical tools. While turning his back, he asks him never to hurt anyone again. The black mage is amazed by his kindness and thanks him several times for sparing his life. In the novel, Javier also forgives the black mage and forces him out of the laboratory. Repellent kills hundreds and transforms into something strange, becoming a demonic villain who fights Javier several times. Even knowing that he was beyond saving, Lloyd still turned his back because he knew from the beginning what he would try to do. Quickly, Javier finishes off the black mage who was ready to attack, removing his head from his body. Before becoming Lloyd, in his past life, he met a man who simply mistreated him for no reason, The supervisor acted like this every day, and the MC always apologized. Thinking that kindness begets kindness, he lowered his head, but precisely because of this, he chose him as an easy prey to be mistreated. One day his anger finally consumed him, and he couldn't stay calm anymore. That day the protagonist gave the beating that bastard deserved. While hitting him, all he could think was that he was screwed. But the result was completely different. The man started to fear him and avoid him. On that day, he realized that there are certain moments when violence needs to be stopped with violence. Villains must receive punishment equal to their crimes. Returning to the orc village, the protagonist notices that his men are very tired. Seeing that he could faint at any moment, Lloyd instructs him to hand over his backpack. The worker hesitates to comply, but Lloyd explains that if he faints, someone will have to carry both him and his backpack. In reality, the young master takes backpacks from all the workers, ties them together, and declares that if anyone complains from now on, they won't receive bonuses. Javier isn't sure if he's doing this just for the backpacks or for the soldiers as well, but the truth doesn't matter to them, since all the soldiers see Lloyd as a trustworthy leader they can follow. The system sends messages asking if he doesn't find this rewarding, but for the protagonist, his only reward is money, nothing more. Arriving at the orc village, the stone-cold storage is already complete. Inside, the young orc notes that it is indeed a bit colder than outside, but not enough to prevent the meat from spoiling. Lloyd says it's still not complete as they lack ice to cool the area. Hiroshi asks how he's going to get ice since their living area is very hot. With a smile, Lloyd says he'll get it one way or another, which makes the orc doubt him, thinking he brought a swindler to the village. However, the young Hulk decides to trust him, since his savior shouldn't be a bad person. When the orc leaves, Javier asks how he's going to make ice, but that's something even the protagonist doesn't know. Javier questions him signing the contract without a plan, but Lloyd explains that to be successful, you have to make the impossible happen. At night, the protagonist sits on rocks pondering how to make ice. First, he made molds and asked his pets to fill them with water, but he doesn't know how to turn it into ice. In this world, there are ice mages, but he doesn't know exactly how their magic works. He knows that magic is a way to control mana freely, a technique based on changing the arrangement of mana in the atmosphere. There are various types of different mana. If he can gather just one type and concentrate it, then he might have what is considered magic. Lloyd asks his pets to fill the giant ice cubes. Even though he can't use mana freely, he can do something similar. Placing his hand in the water and using the Azrahan core technique, he will try to draw only the warm mana and leave the cold in the water. In the first attempt, he does the opposite and pulls only the cold energy. Javier thought he was just being reckless, but apparently, the young master is finding his way proudly. A few days later, he actually succeeds. The orc chief and his son are shivering in the cooling room. What causes all this cold is a huge block of ice made from several smaller ones. Both of them are truly happy. Now they don't need to hunt every day or waste protein. Lloyd looks at Javier with a look that says, "This is the mind of an entrepreneur," and the swordsman agrees that he was indeed right. The orc lord says he is deeply indebted to Lloyd, who has now gained the 120 workers, mentions that he was merely following the contract. However, the chief states they don't take things for granted just because of a contract. Therefore, he and the entire Steel Sand tribe now declare Lloyd Frontera's family as blood brothers, and to celebrate, all the orcs strike the Arnold pose. All friends of the Frontera family will also be their friends, and all enemies will be considered enemies of the entire tribe. The protagonist, pleased, reciprocates by flexing his few muscles. After a week, when they arrived in the city, people's reaction was exactly what they expected. It's obvious they were scared to see 120 muscular orcs entering the city. Lloyd wonders if he should have made a formal announcement to calm the people. It seems even that wouldn't have worked since even his parents, who knew the orcs were coming, were scared. Besides the points the protagonist gained from the orc village, the story of how he saved the workers from the dark mage also spread, leaving him with a total of 911 points. The Baron said he would look for wealthy merchants to buy the orcs' equipment. Now all that's left is to figure out how to use the dark mage's tools. While looking through a book, Lloyd finds something so surprising that he immediately rushes to the mine. There, he searches for the defaulter everywhere and tells him he has great news. The clause in the contract stating he would work for 520 years was a joke. since it makes no sense for someone to live that long. But now he won't have to worry about it, as he found a spell that can turn someone's body into a ghost and control it. This means he will be able to work for the next 520 years. The protagonist asks why he's the only happy one there and tells him to smile. The defaulter forces a smile, while shedding tears of despair. His actions were so cruel that the system says the king of hell is enchanted by his personality. Returning to the mansion, there are things he needs to discuss personally with the Baron. He looks for him everywhere, but a maid says the Baron received a visit from loan sharks. At that moment, Lloyd's expression changes completely. He definitely has something planned for them. In the meeting room, the loan sharks are trying to convince the Baron to hand over the mine in exchange for paying only 10% of the initial debt. While he is silent, thinking about it, the protagonist knocks on the door asking to come in. This time, Lloyd arrives quite friendly to talk to them. They immediately show they have the contract, and that he won't be able to expel them from the house again. However, he continues with his act and humbly asks to make a suggestion. They refuse, but Lloyd keeps talking, leaving them quite irritated. Lloyd goes on and says that if he doesn't make suggestions, it will leave him a little irritated. At that moment, behind him, the young orc appears in fury, asking who made his brother irritated. The two loan sharks are terrified of the orc, but Lloyd tells him not to worry, as they will accept his suggestion. After the meeting, the two loan sharks run out of the mansion. Lloyd tells his father that he would like to make the debt disappear, but since that would be a crime, they must be content with this outcome. He also mentions that the extraction of bituminous coal is going very well. However, now they have another terrible problem to deal with. Orcs eat 10 times more than a normal person, and if they can't resolve this, they will end up with more debts. As he expected, the orcs are great miners. Some of them mine for over 24 hours without stopping and have to be forcibly removed by humans. Their productivity is 10 times better than he expected, and they also refuse to receive wages. Their payment is in food, but the cost of this food has increased so much that Lloyd considers raising taxes to meet this demand. However, continuously raising taxes would be theft, making the population dissatisfied and work less. The simple solution to this problem is for the population to earn more money, and for that, they will use the wasteland in the north of the village, turning a swamp into a farm. Obviously, this won't be easy. Even with knowledge from another world, the protagonist still struggles to create a perfect drainage system. After 21 days of effort and hard work, even Javier asks the Baron if he should stop Lloyd, as he's not sleeping or resting properly. But the chief says that he used to hate his son, as he was worthless. But now seeing all his effort to achieve something, the only thing he can do is respect and not get in his way. When night fell, Lloyd finally managed to create a perfect drainage system. Now, tax money will flow like water. He lies on the ground extremely tired, but compared to the overtime and sleepless nights he used to endure, he can handle it. At this moment, a notification from the system appears in front of him, adding a new option to the design ability, allowing simulations using data obtained through measurement. Lloyd does a quick test, activating his ability on a distant mountain, and when he modifies the structure in an abnormal way, it breaks. He's angry that the system only mentioned this now, after a month of working like crazy. Arriving at the swamp, he starts the first phase of the wetland recovery project. The first step is to have his pets drink all the water from the land. The MC knows that just the two of them won't be able to do it, so he intends to use all his points to summon as many pets as possible. With his current number of RPs, he can summon 4 of them. The pets don't need to have special abilities. They just need to be big enough to drink all the water. The creature that comes out of the portal hits the protagonist's face due to its speed, and when it lands, Lloyd is surprised as it looks like a hippopotamus, an aquatic animal. The 3 pets celebrate by playing among themselves. The protagonist, now hopeful, asks him to show his instructions. Like all the others, Hippo spits out a card, and Lloyd, accustomed to this, picks up the card and reads it, discovering that it won't grow even if fed sunflower seeds. As Hippo doesn't grow like the others, it won't be suitable for this mission, so Lloyd decides to ignore it and summon another. His pets become irritated by his attitude and console their new friend. The protagonist tries to explain that he's not suitable for the job, but the pets go on strike, insisting he acknowledge their values. Lloyd decides to give it a chance and asks about its ability. The small hippo demonstrates the one gulp ability, which allows it to drink a lot of water in just one gulp, but it can only drink what its stomach can hold. Lloyd briefly thought this would be the best ability for the job, but is once again disappointed. Hippo decides to show what it can do and starts drinking water from the lake. The protagonist thinks he's hallucinating. As Hippo seems to be getting bigger, it begins to drink the entire lake, leaving Lloyd astonished by how much it has grown. In a few seconds, that immense swamp dries up. Hippo seems satisfied after drinking so much water, while the protagonist is completely shocked by how much he managed to drink in such a short time. The other two pets look at their master with a "I told you so" expression, while Lloyd asks the system if this is really random since he always gets the magical beasts he needs. But the system is vague and only says he's lucky. Hippo asks if it can keep drinking more. The reincarnated architect tells him to drink until he can't anymore, since the construction of the matrix terrain will start tomorrow. The next day, the workers are amazed at Hippo's size. He's part of the first process, drinking the maximum amount of water and spitting it into the river, repeating this process several times until everything is dry. Then the workers remove the roots of the herbs and the rest of the plants in the soil. Using mana explosion, holes are made, and bamboo is placed while Padong compacts the soil to remove water from the deepest part of the ground. Hippo uses the bamboo as straws. Only after all this, using his simulation ability, they build a dam. With all these processes completed, they have just finished the first sector. Lloyd shouts that after they finish, they'll have a big celebration, cheering up all the workers. After a few days, even Javier is impressed that they turned that abandoned land into cultivated land, but he also wonders when a swordsman started working in construction so naturally. Lloyd arrives shouting his name. He asks Javier to spread seeds along the way to combat some insects. The great swordsman has been reduced to a farmer. Next time, he'll be sure to refuse these requests from the young master. At that moment, the Baron and Baroness arrive, seeing that wonderful scene, and everyone must be thinking the same thing they are. What they're witnessing is a miracle. The people of the village start to show respect for the protagonist, earning him even more RPs. Javier is also happy taking care of his plants, watering them as if they were his daughters. Lloyd says the only thing left to finish everything is the water wheel, a device to prevent the swamp from flooding again. They start to hear horse hooves approaching. An entire cavalry is heading towards them. Lloyd asks who those men are. Javier says that's Viscount Racona, who owns the northern part of the swamp. When they arrive, the protagonist identifies himself as responsible for the construction. One of the mounted subordinates says this is the Viscount's land, and they should leave immediately. The Mara's swamp is a place that hasn't been visited by anyone for hundreds of years. The northern part is land administered by Viscount Lacona, while the southern part is administered by the Frontera. However, they obviously claimed rights over the land out of nowhere, aiming to take this fertile land without any effort from the start. It makes sense for them to insist on handing over the land, since a part of the swamp is indeed their property. That much is clear until now. Lloyd asks the Viscount if he's really saying that his land was invaded. The man on horseback tries to speak but is interrupted by the protagonist, who says this conversation is among nobles. The man gets angry, while the farmers question the young master's actions. Lloyd introduces himself as the eldest son of the Frontera family. The Viscount comments that his behavior is indecent and asks to call Baron Frontera. The MC pretends not to have heard and scratches his ear. When questioned, he says the only thing he heard was the sound of a dung fly. The Viscount looks for the fly but is alerted by his guard that the young man is referring to him. Lloyd talks about the laws of the kingdom's lands, Law number 321, a special law about cultivating wasteland. If wasteland is abandoned for a long time, it's possible to establish ownership of the land. If left unattended for 100 years without residence or cultivation, it's considered land without an owner. To be recognized as property, the land must meet one of 4 requirements, and one of them is to have a harvest of at least one specific planting. At that moment, Javier remembers his conversation with Lloyd some time ago, where he mentioned that the seeds are to rid the land of pests. The protagonist congratulates the Viscount on witnessing the first harvest in the history of the Mara's swamp. Realizing that he had already prepared himself, the Viscount feels deceived. Lloyd kindly gives the cabbage as a gift to him and orders the cavalry to leave his territory, or else they would be considered trespassers. Seeing them all leave disappointed, Javier asks if he received a prophecy that these people were coming. In reality, this isn't the first time the protagonist has dealt with people trying to take advantage of others' efforts. All the farmers are also satisfied and celebrate that the young master managed to protect their lands. However, he continues to maintain his mercenary pose, only thinking about money, and tells everyone to get back to work. Late at night, the protagonist sits watching the crops being hit by a huge storm. With summer ending, autumn brings rain. Even though he has used simulation hundreds of times, he shouldn't let his guard down and observe until the end. By morning, the rain has passed, and with it, the worry. Thanks to his great invention, that land didn't turn back into a swamp, and he even gained achievement points from the system. Now that the first thing is done, he will move on to the next step. Meanwhile, in Viscount Lacona's territory, he might be indignant with the situation. If they continue planting for 2 years, the land will officially be theirs. The swamp is the land where golden eggs will hatch. Even his stomach is hurting from having to give up his precious land. He can't let this fertile land slip from his hands and asks his executive to call the dye workshop supervisor. A few days later, Lloyd wakes up from his bed with a severe headache. Perhaps the long days without sleep have finally caught up. Even so, he can't just lie in bed, as there's much to do. The problem arises when even Javier wakes up strangely. He's also experiencing the same headache, making the protagonist realize that this isn't just a coincidence, but something intentionally done by someone. It wasn't just the two of them who were affected. The maid Emily, Mr. Alap, the boy in charge of the cows, and the cows themselves were all affected. In summary, this is affecting everyone in the village, humans and animals alike. The animals with better instincts refuse to drink water, leading the protagonist to believe that the water must be causing this. Lloyd's greatest weapon in this world is his knowledge, but after the incident with the ants, he realized that not everything is as it seems. Expecting the Viscount to take action, research was done on his territory, revealing that his main source of income is dye technology using the Ladona fruit. The problem is that this fruit can be toxic to humans. Due to his envy and greed, Racona, without a doubt, sabotaged the village's water. Inside the mansion, Baron Frontera is shocked by a proposal. The Viscount's subordinate demands half of the wetlands, promising they would stop dumping dye waste into the water. The protagonist's father calls it blackmail, but that's exactly what he planned to do. Even if taken to court, it will take at least 2 years for a verdict, and with all the legal fees and the cost of new clean water, it will be very expensive for him. At that moment, Lloyd enters the room, telling his father that their parasitic neighbors are tampering with the water. The door slams in the subordinate's face, who complains to the protagonist for insulting his master. With a look of anger, the protagonist remarks that he didn't know trash parasites could understand humans. Humiliated again, the knight cannot contain his anger, drawing his sword and challenging him to a duel. Shortly after, we see the same scene again, with Lloyd beating someone who has already surrendered. After the person cries and begs for mercy, Lloyd pretends to be satisfied, only to beat him again shortly afterward. The Baron warns his son that the duel is over, but his expressions show he's quite pleased with what he's doing. After being beaten, the subordinate returns to his master, who calls him trash for being beaten by the incompetent son of the Baron. However, upon reflection, the subordinate did a good job because the Frontera can only take the case to court, and they can use this public beating to delay the process by 3 or 4 years. At least, that's what the protagonist thinks the Viscount is planning. However, as a Frontera, he will resolve this using his own methods, rallying the population to defend their lands from greed. First, to solve the water problem, they build a reservoir using hippo to bring water from a local river before it becomes polluted, filling the reservoir. Javier says it's a good solution, but they'll have to do it every day without rest. Lloyd says it's only a temporary solution. The real plan is to build a water supply system. To do this, infrastructure will have to be built to bring water from Lake Kapua in the eastern mountains, which will be a massive undertaking in terms of work and costs. However, the protagonist knows exactly how they will recover what was spent, multiplied by 100. Months later, the Viscount is extremely anxious about something. The manager informs him that the eldest son of Baron Frontera is requesting an audience to help solve recent problems. Inside the room, Lloyd sarcastically remarks that he's doing very well and is there to help with his problems. The Viscount tries to play dumb, saying he has no problems, but Lloyd insists he could save his dye workshop from bankruptcy. At that moment, the Viscount understands that the crisis he's facing is the fault of young Frontera. But before he says anything, Lloyd explains that due to the waste he dumped in the river, they had to bring water from Lake Kapua. Workers had to dig a long path of land, laying pipes for the water to pass through. In the middle of the route, they came across a huge valley, and their only alternative was to build a Roman-style aqueduct. For this, Javier had to blast a lot of limestone, as it's a material used in construction. Some limestone rocks ended up accidentally in the river. Anxiously, the Viscount asks, "What the hell does this have to do with your paint workshop?" Lloyd explains that the water flowing to the workshop is full of limestone, which caused their clothes to be dyed brown. Rakona says she will take them to court, and the protagonist says it will take at least 2 years, asking if anyone will remember their products during that time. Afraid of going bankrupt, the Viscount is totally shocked. Lloyd, having already satisfied him by dispelling his doubts, bids farewell. But as he's leaving, he's threatened by the Viscount, who says he'll make his life hell. Outside, Javier questions Lloyd's intentions. All he did was provoke him, but that man is truly dangerous due to his connections in the capital. The MC asks him to wait and see who has more to lose. A month later, the Viscount kneels to beg for help to save his paint workshop. With a tone of superiority, Lloyd asks if 2 of his prosperous connections said he couldn't win this case. Deeply regretful, the Viscount apologizes, but the protagonist isn't interested in pride or apologies. All he wants is for the Viscount to sign a contract. If he signs it, water will be supplied to his workshop in a week. Seeing the exorbitant amount he'll have to pay, he asks why someone would put a price on water. The protagonist finds it strange, as he was the one who taught him that water isn't free. Startled, the Viscount sees no alternative but to sign. Even his father is scared to receive such a large sum of money every month. With a cynical expression, he says the Viscount is a very generous man. Javier thinks that the Viscount started the battle, but now, the protagonist seems like the devil himself. That contract doesn't have a specific end date, which means he'll take everything from the Viscount until he dies. In fact, knowing Lloyd's personality, he'll be draining his money for generations. Like a demon king, Lloyd wouldn't let this slide with just a pat on the back. If he could exchange blood vessels for money, he'd rip them all out. The Count also has great news to share. He found a buyer for the Orc tribe's treasures. When the protagonist asks who bought them, he finds it really odd, as someone like him would easily be able to buy new pieces. His father doesn't know the details exactly, but it seems like he wants to build a statue in the sea. At that moment, we see Count Cremo looking out his window. On the horizon, something starts rising from the sea. A great monster emerges from the depths of the oceans. The Count looks at it angrily. The creature comes entirely out of the sea, ready to attack everything in its path. The next day, we return to the Frontera territory. Javier reported to the Baron that they would be leaving in a week, and, to minimize expenses, the young master requested about 10 men to accompany him. Taking care of a plant, he said that if that's what his son wants to do, then he should fulfill his request. Javier asked him not to worry since he would be monitoring him closely. The Baron mentioned that when the night of Viscount Lacona came to blackmail him, he was terrified and actually considered giving up the lands. However, after seeing his son and the efforts of the people, he found courage. The Baron said he had always been an indecisive and incompetent lord, but Javier disagreed, saying he was the opposite, a welcoming and kind person, more so than any other noble. Despite appreciating his subordinate's words, he still couldn't say he was a good lord because of it. A leader should have firm principles and be willing to act, just like Lloyd. Javier knew that the only principle that guy had was money, but he was starting to doubt if that was so bad. The Baron stated that Javier's mission was no longer to monitor but to protect him since he was the heir to this land. Javier accepted his request, but even though Lloyd had miraculously revived the family's fortunes, he would never be able to like him. In the past, the Baron rescued him and asked what he would like to be when he grew up. Young Javier said he wanted to become a knight so he could protect him. Since he survived the winter alone, the Baron was sure he would become a great knight. On that day, he carved a wooden sword and gave it as a gift, but young Lloyd mocked him, asking how an orphan could become a knight, and broke the sword his father had carved. Javier returned to his room, taking off his coat while looking at the broken sword he had kept for so many years, sure that he could never like Lloyd. The MC started attending to his recurring client, joking that Javier couldn't live without him anymore. To help him sleep, Professor Miram began reciting the discharge compression method. Almost falling asleep, Javier was sure he should hate him, but it's as if he had transformed into a completely different person. It's hard to admit, but he had become a decent person. In the middle of the night, while both were in a deep sleep, an assassin invaded Lloyd's room and blamed everything on him. The assassin leaped from the window ready to stab him, but Javier quickly woke up and attacked the assassin, cutting his sword and leg. Due to the commotion, the protagonist woke up and saw Javier immobilizing the Knight of Viscount Racona. The next day, while monitoring the work, he reminded his employees of the company motto, "Safety first." Javier arrived, saying he handed the assassin over to the Viscount. He probably tried to target him because he was fired, as Racona is paying a lot for the water. The protagonist said it made sense since he was a well-paid knight, but all he did was get beaten up by his brother. Realizing that his master already expected something like this to happen, Javier asked why he didn't take any precautionary measures. Lloyd was confused by his question, wondering why he should take precautions when Javier is his bodyguard. Thanks to him, the protagonist could move so freely. When you think about it, it should have been impossible for a 5-year-old boy who lost his village in a monster attack to survive the winter. But he did and even became a knight. Is there anyone more reliable than him to be his bodyguard? Hearing the sincere words of the protagonist, Javier slowly started to let go of his long-standing resentment. He hated himself for thinking it, but Lloyd really is a decent guy. Since they would have finished the pipe construction by tomorrow, they could finally prepare to go to Cremo to make a lot of money. On the way, the protagonist falls asleep on Javier's back, which angers Javier enough to elbow Lloyd in the face. Lloyd wakes up, asking if he really just got hit. The MC decides to get off and asks Javier to teach him horseback riding. Javier retorts that he is a knight, not a teacher. Lloyd says it's in order. Javier calls him repulsive, but the system continues with automatic translation, making the protagonist angry and telling him to shut up. Then he receives a truly useful notification. Rumors of his incredible construction work have spread, earning him even more fame points. Realizing that fame means money, the protagonist now sees a great future ahead. The journey there isn't short. Winter arrives while they're still on the road, so they only manage to reach Cremo in the middle of winter. The Baron there greets them. He had heard rumors about a talented builder, but never imagined he would look so young. However, he's not saying this to the protagonist but to Javier. Lloyd tries to interrupt, but the Count is determined to marry Javier to his daughter. Due to the interruption, the Count gets angry, asking how a mere servant dares to interrupt a noble's conversation, even making the system laugh at the MC's face. A while later, they manage to explain the situation. Lloyd is in deep depression, while Javier struggles not to laugh. To make matters worse, the Baron says it's Lloyd's fault for being born with the appearance of a servant. This man in front of him is the Lord of Cremo, the commercial city, and also an important character from the novel, helping Javier when he became a criminal. He wants to buy jewels to decorate a statue to be placed in the sea. However, his business is declining because some years ago, a monster appeared on the coast, the Giga Titan. Although it never attacked, it remains a source of fear. In fact, he had read about it in the novel. As people in this era lack ways to attack in the water, Cremo continued to decline until it entered a crisis. He thought Javier could help, but the work ended before a solution was found. The Count researched how to scare off this creature and found out it fears mermaids, as they are its natural predators. So, he wanted to build a large mermaid statue far out at sea but gave up on the idea because raising the seabed to build a statue obstructs boat passage. The protagonist sees this as an opportunity and says he will build the support for that statue. By combining a friction pile and a crate, it will be possible to raise a column to place the statue. With Javier, he goes by boat to where he wants to place the structure and dips his head into the cold water, activating his ability. The ocean floor is flat, making construction easier. However, he can't bear to stay submerged for long as the water starts freezing his face. Javier seems happy watching Lloyd shiver from the cold and apologizes, saying it's the first time seeing someone suffer that makes him so happy. Also, Javier is curious about how Lloyd will build something from the ocean floor to the surface. To do this, he'll need to use magic. Lloyd says the only magic he'll need is cement magic, but the question is how he creates cement in this world. Back on the deck, Javier sarcastically tells him not to look where he's going and fall, to which Lloyd responds that his sarcasm is reaching master swordsman level, calling him a master of irony. Looking back, a young blonde lady asks if he's Master Lloyd, and seeing the love letter in his hand, the protagonist blushes. Lloyd, however, is disappointed when the letter is delivered to Javier. He kind of expected it, but seeing the swordsman tuck away the love letter, as if nothing happened, fills Lloyd with rage, asking how he could look at the love letter and act like it was nothing. At that moment, Javier becomes startled, realizing that the protagonist has never received a love letter. He doesn't know what to say to console him, and wishes for him to stay strong. Consumed by hatred and envy, the MC tries to tell himself that he isn't feeling this way while working on the Pillar project. The Count appears, saying he managed to gather most of the materials Javier had requested, except for volcanic ash. Ash is the main ingredient in Roman cement, and the advantages of making this cement are obvious since its structures have stood for over 2,000 years. To obtain ash, they would have to go to a volcano, but even the Count doesn't think they have that much time. The protagonist says he will find another way, giving up on making Roman cement and focusing on Portland cement. This was the cement that gave rise to modern cement. The MC knows roughly how to make it but not the specifics, so using his brain, he will experiment with all possible combinations and figure out how to make it. However, even after 129 samples, he still hasn't made a strong enough cement. Seeing his master exerting so much effort, his pets become sad, trying their best to get him out of the house a little. He shouts that he's busy but remembers a little dog he had in his past life. At that time, it was his only family. After its death, he regretted not playing more with it. Lloyd then hugs his pets and says they are more important than the research. While walking through the streets at night, Lloyd apologizes to them. Until now, he has only been giving orders as if they were machines, but if something happened to them, he would regret it deeply. Seeing his sincere feelings, the pet's relationship with the protagonist changes, and now they start to consider him part of the pack. Even the system congratulates him on one of their evolutions. The pets themselves ask for his sister Cobra to evolve. She starts to glow and float, gaining several new abilities. But the ability that catches Lloyd's attention the most is volcanic explosion. The next day, a huge explosion is seen from the mountains, and the people in the city are frightened by it. Even the Lord thinks it might be an enemy bombardment, but it turns out it was just the protagonist testing the new ability of his little snake. Using her ability, he analyzes that the ashes are indeed volcanic ashes. Excited, he tells Javier that this is an absolute gift, but due to the explosion, Javier isn't hearing anything. Thanks to Bangul, the cement problem is quickly resolved, wasting no time and moving on to the first step of the pillar construction. They built a massive diaper to collect the volcanic ashes, and when Bangul activates his ability, the diaper prevents the ashes from spreading. The entire population is impressed with Lloyd's ingenuity, especially the Baron, who will keep an eye on him and analyze his creations to make an impartial report to His Majesty the King. Once the ingredients for the cement are gathered, it's time for the second step. A large coffin to pour the cement into is made and placed in the sea, using Hippo to quickly remove all the water from the coffin. The third step is to cover the bottom of the coffin with wooden stakes to anchor it, obviously done by Javier since he is the strongest. He quickly finishes using all the stakes and asks when more will be brought, leaving the protagonist impressed that he hasn't complained so far. Reminded of his duty, Javier drops the hammer and walks away, but as usual, Lloyd uses emotional blackmail to make him come back to work. When the protagonist finishes the morning training, he uses Bangle's steel manure launcher to build the tower structure, finally pouring the long-awaited cement. Once the cement dries, they dismantle the wooden coffin, completing the first large artificial maritime platform. Lloyd explains to the Lord that they made it 50 centimeters higher than sea level to give the impression that the mermaid is floating. The Baron is still hesitant, and doesn't believe this foundation can support the weight of the statue. But if it does work, he won't be disappointed with the construction fee. At night, the statue is finally placed on the platform, a grand mermaid statue covered with sparkling jewels. To celebrate the achievement, a nobles' party is held on the ships. The protagonist, obliged to participate, feels uncomfortable in his outfit and asks Javier how he can stand wearing it. The Lord introduces Lloyd, saying it was this young man who made the statue a reality. And once again, the protagonist is ignored by people who mistake him for Javier. He knows he's smarter than most and prefers money transfers to compliments. But the look of sadness on Javier's face annoys him greatly. To completely crush his self-esteem, the Lord appears, saying it's because of his face. While the party is going on, a little distant from the ships, at the bottom of the sea, the Giga Titan observes the statue. Seeing that mermaid, his natural enemy, all he can think about is attacking her. He quickly approaches the ships, where the protagonist chats with other nobles, and Javier captivates all the women present with just his presence. He goes to the edge of the ship and drinks his wine peacefully, but he feels a slight tremor in his glass, causing him to look towards the sea. At that moment, the protagonist approaches, asking what he's doing. Javier thinks something is coming towards them, something fast and about the size of 2 ships, making the protagonist realize exactly what it is. He approaches the Lord and speaks quietly so only he can hear, that the Giga Titan is approaching and they must evacuate everyone. The Count calls his knight and asks if he feels anything strange in the sea, but he says no. Since he has reached the level of Sword Master, the Count trusts his senses. But the protagonist knows that Javier's senses are even sharper since he is the main character. The Lord continues, saying that the Giga Titan has never attacked them in all these years. But Lloyd says that now he has a reason to attack and looks at the large mermaid statue. At that moment, the Lord realizes what is about to happen and orders the anchors to be raised and the boat to be moved away from the statue immediately. Realizing that this will take too long, the protagonist asks Javier to take care of the anchors. Without hesitation, he jumps into the cold water while the protagonist throws Padong at the statue. Under the sea, Javier prepares an attack on the chains, using his mana to heat the blade. He cuts them easily, while Padong breaks the ropes that are attached to the statue. When Javier finishes cutting all the chains, he realizes that the Giga Titan is speeding up. Even though the ships are already loose, it is too late. The Giga Titan appears, knocking everything in its path. The protagonist and the others on the boat are thrown into the sea, while Padong dodges the monster's attack. Javier uses a mana explosion to quickly get out of the water, saving Lloyd from falling into the sea, while the statue is hurled into the city, destroying everything and almost hitting some people. The people thrown into the sea are in despair. The protagonist knows there won't be time to save everyone, but has a brilliant idea. He uses Hippo to drink the seawater and pull people along. Meanwhile, the Giga Titan emerges from the sea and heads to land to destroy the entire city. Javier tells his master that they should try to stop it, but the protagonist is already fleeing to the other side. Lloyd says that trying to stop something that big is foolishness. He will only die trying to do that. Many things are happening at the same time. The Lord orders his subordinates to rescue the men at sea by throwing ladders from the ships that have not yet sunk. Meanwhile, in the city, the gigantic Titan continues to destroy everything. Javier asks if Lloyd is really going to ignore the people who are in danger, but his only concern is to get the money. Lloyd says they didn't come there to fight a giant thing but to keep the peace. At that moment, Javier is disappointed with his master. He thought Lloyd was someone who always fought to protect others, but now he sees who he truly is. As a gentleman, he would never abandon people in distress. Lloyd tries to warn him that if he tries to fight that thing, he will die. But Javier doesn't listen to his orders and heads towards the monster. Using his blade board and mana blast, he quickly approaches the coast. The soldiers shoot cannonballs at the gigantic Titan, but they are only reflected by his armor. The soldiers are scared as not even a scratch is made. The monster prepares an attack by opening its armor, and the wind power that comes out is so strong that it destroys the attack towers. The monster's real concern is not the soldiers but the supposed mermaid that it believes is still alive. Only its advance towards the statue destroys a large part of the city, causing fear and panic among the population. A man who fell on the ground is almost trampled by the gigantic Titan, but Javier appears to save him. He attacks the monster directly, hitting one of its joints, but even using the mana blast, his attack is reflected, only making the Titan angrier. Javier dodges its attack, but the monster takes advantage of him being in the air and fires a burst. Even trying to protect himself, he is hit directly. With just one attack, Javier is already quite injured. He knows it will be impossible to defeat this creature, but he is willing to sacrifice himself so that as many people as possible are saved. While Javier fights to save the population, the protagonist tries to escape on a table. It's not like he's an overpowered character or anything. Even if he spent all his RP, the only skills he has are related to construction. It's not that he's not sad about people being hurt and the city being destroyed, but he can't do anything. However, when the protagonist says these words, something clicks in his head. He realizes he must return immediately since the Lord hasn't paid the construction department's commission yet. While Lloyd advances quickly to the city, Javier fiercely fights the creature. Dodging its attack, he thinks that as monstrous as it is, it's still an animal. Its weak point is probably in the eye. However, even using the mana blast and attacking the eye directly, nothing happens to the monster. With nothing else to do, Javier is attacked by one of its antennas. But Hippo appears just in time to save him, releasing all the water and returning to the protagonist's head. Lloyd is extremely angry because the giant lobster dared to interfere with his cash flow. Javier takes advantage of the opening his master created to attack the monster, but once again the attack is only repelled by the armor. He becomes scared since he can't get through this thing. At first, he thought he could win, but now he knows it's impossible. However, even though the situation is unfavorable, he remains calm since his master has returned. There is a possibility of victory. 2 minutes earlier, the protagonist was using the Padang to move through the city, observing from afar as he tries to find a weak spot using his ability to understand what it's made of. Its armor is 1 meter thick, a mix of dentina and quintina, molecularly a triple honeycomb structure tightly intertwined. When Javier attacks, all the impact energy is transferred to his horn, releasing it into the air. Inside the creature, there is a sac for its hydraulic claw. If they can destroy the beak and hit that sac with the blessed mana, the creature will surely be killed. Javier asks what he should do, while Lloyd gestures to cut the horn with his hand, but the swordsman doesn't understand anything and asks if he's gone crazy. The protagonist then decides to shout, explaining that he should cut the horn, while Javier elegantly dodges the attack from the giant lobster, knowing that cutting the horn won't cause lethal damage. But his master wouldn't ask for it without a plan behind it. Lloyd warns that even though it's hollow inside, it won't be easily cut and that mana circles aren't just about hitting. Javier doesn't exactly know what he means by that, but instead of just hitting, he uses the mana circle like an electric saw to cut. The protagonist is happy knowing that his theory really worked. This time Javier's attack really seems to damage the monster, and when he is about to be attacked, the MC uses the Padang to defend him. Javier finally manages to cut the horn, making the creature scream in pain, but the only thing that falls to the ground is his sword, leaving the protagonist totally shocked. Even knowing he would be crushed by the Giga Titan, Javier stayed underneath it to attack. He was willing to sacrifice himself to defeat it. However, at the last second, Padang rescued him. The hamster scolded Javier, who, even though he didn't understand exactly what he was saying, understood that he was probably being reprimanded for being reckless. After thoroughly analyzing the Giga Titan, the only remaining option to defeat it was the combination of Plan A plus D. To do this, he first called Padang and told him to take him to the location he mentioned earlier. Lloyd warned that the creature now saw Javier as a threat, so he asked Javier to lure the monster into the forest. The protagonist had bought enough time. They should have finished by now, so the only thing left to do was to trust the Count. 15 minutes earlier, the Lord was in shock watching his city being destroyed by the monster. His knight apologized for not detecting it earlier, but the Count said the fault was actually his. It was a mistake to think they could drive out the beast with just a statue. At that moment, the protagonist stated that the statue did drive it away. That monster only came to destroy it, and recommended taking advantage of this obsession. He would buy as much time as possible for the Count to prepare something. Javier continued dodging the beast's attacks, but even he was reaching his limit, yet he kept luring the creature relentlessly into the forest. The Giga Titan remained an unstoppable force that destroyed everything in its path, and Javier couldn't run anymore, getting closer to being caught by the creature. Before he was caught, the protagonist shouted, asking for applause for the bronze statue. When Javier looked, Lloyd was bringing the statue, now fully patched up. Seeing its natural enemy, the Giga Titan flew into a rage, leaving Lloyd quite pleased with its reaction. Through the novel, He knew he could trust the Count to reassemble the statue. His plan was to use it to create an opening for Javier to attack. When they got close enough to the monster, Padong drifted the cart, and they began to lure the Titan towards them. Javier seized the opportunity to attack the creature's weak point, hitting it precisely with a mana blast. Even though the attack was powerful and created a huge explosion, all it did was create a crack in the armor. Javier was saddened by his weakness, but as he fell, he heard Lloyd say to leave the rest to him. As your master spoke with great confidence, he knows he can now relax. Before he hits the ground, Hippo appears to cushion his fall. Lloyd shouts that he will protect this city no matter what. Padong is also at his limit, and he can't ask for more from him. At his signal, Padong throws the protagonist towards the Giga Titan. Earlier, when he was still heading to save the city, he thought of some plans to attack it, deciding he should use the mana blast. The problem is, for that, he would need to have a triple circle heart, and currently, he only has 2. Using the system, he starts to evolve his technique, but unfortunately, he doesn't have enough points to evolve to the final level. Even though he had decided to stay out of the fight, he wonders what the hell he's doing hanging there, while deciding whether he should try to punch it using mana. The notification that he gained 5 approval points from Javier appears, and with that, he has what he needs to create the 3rd mana circle. Now confident, he prepares the attack using 1 circle to protect the heart and the other 2 to collide, but the monster ends up breaking a mountain with its paw, and one of the stones coincidentally hits the protagonist's head. Due to the impact, he loses his senses, not knowing what to do anymore. He uses the 3 circles to collide, creating a triple circle mana blast that is so powerful it explodes the entire creature. From the city, people see that huge smoke. The creature is now completely dead. Lloyd's pets try to wake Javier up. Slowly, he gets up and sees the Giga Titan on the ground, impressed that he actually succeeded. However, Padong is not happy at all and tries to get Javier's attention. He follows the 3 desperate pets, finding Lloyd a little further ahead, with a bleeding head and lifeless eyes. He gets close and listens to his heart. However, Lloyd has no heartbeat. A carrier pigeon flies to the Frontera household, where the Count retrieves the letter and is completely startled by its contents. He immediately mounts his horse and sets off towards Cremo. In the letter he read, the Lord of Cremo mentions that his eldest son, Lloyd, admirably completed all the construction work they needed, but after the party, the city faced great danger, and at that moment Lloyd and his guards sacrificed themselves to save countless lives, leaving Lloyd in an unusual coma state. The Baron hurries to Cremo, worried about his son, yet recalling all the moments he shared with the new Lloyd, who never called him father, only Baron. For a moment, Frontera doubts if that young man is truly his son, but before he can dwell on it, a monster appears on the road. The knight dismounts and instructs the Count to continue while he faces the creature. He defends against the beast's first attack, apologizes to the Count, and promises to meet again in Cremo. The knight and the monster attack simultaneously, but the wolf is too strong, breaking the sword in half and biting the swordsman's shoulder. Undeterred, the knight continues to fight, even as he's overpowered. Just when he thinks he'll die, the Baron and Baroness appear, aiding him in defeating the wolf. The knight feels ashamed for not handling the creature alone, but the Baron reminds him that he's a vassal, and it's his duty to protect his people. Suddenly, the Baroness notices something alarming, a pack of wolves approaching. The knight, despite his injuries, stands his ground against the wolves, while the Baron and Baroness lose hope. Then Javier arrives, swiftly dispatching the wolves and offering to escort them, asking if anyone is hurt. The Baron's knight knew Javier was skilled, but wonders what made him so powerful since arriving in Cremo. The Baroness asks if Lloyd is alright, but Javier can't say for sure if he's alive or not. He explains that after the giant was defeated, Lloyd had no heartbeat. Worried that he would lose his new home, Javier was suddenly relieved when Lloyd's pulse returned. Although he's sure Lloyd's heart has stopped, he still has a pulse and is breathing. Touching Lloyd's chest, Javier feels the triple circle heart spinning at an incredible speed due to the magnetic fields they're generating. He can't determine the condition of his heart, only that these fields are keeping him alive. Returning to the present, people are trying to rebuild the city. Javier explains that the young master is at the Count's mansion, under a doctor's care, but his condition hasn't improved. The Count reflects on their battle against such a monstrous creature, but Javier insists he was just a sword Lloyd was using, it was his own strength that defeated the monster. Hearing this, not even the protagonist's parents believe he has this power until they hear that other nobles are heading to the Count's mansion to pay respects to Lloyd, acknowledging that without him, everyone would have frozen to death. Lloyd didn't just save the people from the sea, he also helped a soldier trapped in rubble, preventing a massive fire from destroying the city. Indeed, the entire city recognizes that they were saved thanks to Lloyd Frontera, and everyone outside the Baron's house pays homage to him. A man tries to start an argument, blaming Lloyd for the incident because of a statue he made, but he's beaten by the crowd, who are quite agitated. In the room, the protagonist finally wakes up, his head hurting, and some system notifications are in front of him. He remembers using the triple mana blast like an idiot, and wonders if he's really alive. The system confirms he is, prompting the protagonist to ask how, since his heart should have exploded. At that moment, Javier enters the room and is shocked by the scene. Lloyd is happy to see him, immediately asking how much they will be paid for the construction. For a moment, Javier is disappointed that these were his first words, but he's happy soon after because Lloyd seems healthy. The Baron and Baroness rush into the room, embracing their son who has just awakened. Whether he is the true Lloyd or not doesn't matter now, they are just grateful he's alive. In the royal capital of Magenta, a servant reports to the king about the letter from the Count of Cremo. The king is intrigued that such a man exists in his kingdom, and instructs his subordinate to send a message to Baron Frontera to bring his son and guard. The Royal Highness, Alicia, declares that she will meet this man and evaluate him herself. Returning to Cremo, the system states that your great courage, wisdom, and self-sacrifice are spreading throughout the kingdom. Thanks to having taken your social position, he gained 1,500 RP. Additionally, he also obtained a mana heart, which explains why he has so much energy even though he's been in a coma for a month. Now that he has become the owner of a mana heart, digging will be much easier. The system questions if that's the only way he can think of using it, but the protagonist wonders if he's underestimating the world's builders. Since his mana heart emerged abnormally, it has unique properties. He gained the ability of neutralized shock, which literally means he can use the triple core explosion whenever he wants. Now the work in the mine will be much faster. The protagonist explains that the mana heart needs to be protected from the impacts caused by blessed mana. It acts practically like an ammunition depot, which is why he must protect the mana heart using one of the circles. But at that moment, he didn't have a mana heart, so he was able to survive the shock caused by the explosion. Who would have thought that neglecting mana heart training would end up being beneficial? At that moment, the Lord enters the carriage, saying they must leave immediately. As he watches the Lord go to sit down, the protagonist gives a look as if planning something. The carriage continues through the city streets, and looking out the window, Lloyd wonders how much it will cost to repair the buildings and streets. The Lord says it's hard to say, but it will probably take a month of the city's budget production. Upon hearing this, the protagonist plays his card and says that if the Giga Titan had not been defeated, it would probably take half a year of production to repair everything. Realizing what's happening, the Lord immediately asks what he means by that. Lloyd says that what he's gaining compared to what they'll save in construction is a small portion. He continues using his manipulation game and mentions that he heard from some attendants that the Lord would financially compensate anyone who worked for the city's public interest. Realizing he has no choice, the Lord increases the amount he will receive by 1.5 times. The atmosphere in the carriage remains heavy. The protagonist says he wasn't asking for money, but he finally realizes that for the Lord, the lives of his civilians are worth 1.5 times the commission of his construction. Due to emotional blackmail, the Baron doubles the commission. Lloyd remains silent with a cold expression on his face, causing the Baron to increase the proposal to triple. At that moment, we see in the window's reflection the monstrous expression the protagonist is making. The Baron realizes he has just been extorted, while the MC extends his hand to him. Now with a completely friendly atmosphere, he appreciates his generosity, and says he will make good use of the special compensation. The Lord shakes his hand, though he finds it very strange since he was definitely just extorted. Still, he can't bring himself to hate him. The Count's carriage passes through the crowd, who are shouting incessantly that Master Lloyd has arrived. For someone who is a complete nobody in Korea, this is a lot of pressure. The Lord says they have prepared a podium for him, using a voice amplification sphere. The protagonist thinks of giving a generic speech since he won't make money from it. So on stage, seeing the crowd shout his name, the only thing he can think of is making money from each of those people. Instead of giving a speech, he asks if the citizens have heard of Andal coding. Realizing they haven't, he begins to explain how Andal will change their lives. All the time they spend by the fireplace will be replaced with peaceful family time, greatly improving their quality of life. Anyone interested should visit Baron Frontier's mansion, located in the Frontier Barony. Instead of a speech about saving the city, he just sold his product. The Lord understands why he doesn't hate him. Someone so obsessed with every penny of profit that persists in their goals is someone you can't hate, but rather desire by your side. Returning home, or rather, his future golden goose, Lloyd thought that the oldest knight, Lord Byron, earned far too much compared to his level of skill, which barely reached intermediate. However, the man in front of him left him completely amazed. He neatly organized the ongoing mining plans, the list of names and details of land construction, and simply everything that needed management, even down to sales and profit. Startled, the protagonist asked if he had done all this while he was away. Byron replied that he had left it for him to take care of, so he was just doing his job. A worker arrived and reported that the interior of the Andal floor project was complete and awaited inspection. Outside, he meticulously observed every detail of the floor, praising the workers for this time there were no flaws. Lloyd was simply shocked looking at him. This man he thought useless was extremely capable. If he had been born in modern Korea, he would probably be a director of a major corporation. The large-scale contract was entirely handled by the Baron and Baroness. These two had a gift beyond being lords of a state, making the protagonist realize that your luck starts the moment you are born. Javier asked if they really needed such a large warehouse for coal, but the protagonist said yes, as it would continue to come in all the time. With what he earned from construction alone, he managed to pay off more than half of his debt, and thanks to foolish neighbors, he would continue to pay without problems, leaving him truly glad that his retirement of fun and joy was almost here. Seeing the disdainful expression on his master's face, the only thing Javier thought about was punching him several times. But before he could do that, they both heard a trumpet, and the worst part was that neither of them knew what it meant. When they looked, a man on horseback holding the royal flag approached. The protagonist was angry at this ridiculous display and wanted to get straight to the point, feeling a terrible foreboding that this meant trouble. The man began to read the king's letter. Due to what he had done in the city of Cremo, his efforts to protect the nobles and civilians had been noted, and the king wished to meet with the two heroes who defeated the Giga Titan. His father was extremely happy, but Lloyd realized how problematic this situation was. If there was one thing he had learned in the army, it was never to stand out too much. Once, a superior found out he was a civil engineer and asked him to build a sauna. He studied like mad to create one, but that was also his worst mistake because it turned out too perfect, and then the superiors started making many requests of him. Upon hearing that they had to visit the Majesty, he knew he shouldn't have built that platform in the ocean. Inside the royal carriage, he felt completely hopeless. Javier said he looked like he was going to be executed, which was unexpected since his master would probably have said something like, "How much can I extract from Majesty?" This made him see a bit of color in the world again since he had read the novel and knew some things that would happen. If he could use all that to his advantage, he would surely get the most money possible from the Majesty. Arriving at the palace, Lloyd and Javier knelt before her. When they looked up, Lloyd almost had a heart attack because of her beauty. When the protagonist introduced himself, Majesty was surprised that he was Lloyd Frontera since he and his side had a much more noble aura. She also sensed a different mana flow coming from Javier, and he seemed worthy of being her fighting partner, as expected of one of the kingdom's two martial masters. She immediately discerned that Javier was special. It seemed awkward flattery wouldn't work on her. The queen appreciates the courage and altruism he demonstrated. However, she doesn't judge a man based on what others say, but rather on what she sees. As the protagonist already expected, she wants to test his abilities. The opportunity Lloyd was hoping for has arisen. If he does well, he'll secure a contract with the Majesty. So the queen asks which construction he thinks is most urgent in the royal capital. Even though the protagonist has just arrived, he obviously knows, having read the novel. The queen thinks that if he is truly capable, he will perceive it the moment he enters the royal palace. The most important construction at this moment is repairing this ruined palace. At least that's what she would like to hear, but Lloyd says that the most important construction now is a bridge over the Magenta River. The queen looks at him with a displeased look. The protagonist knows this is not the answer she expected, but given his personality, the test won't end here. Queen Magenta is the one with great authority and absolute power, a tolerant, fair, impartial woman who listens to everyone regardless of their class or rank. She asks why the bridge is necessary. The protagonist says other men might think differently and say that repairing the royal palace is most important. He knows a dragon with a bad temper took down 2 towers of the palace, which is why the roof is so heavy. However, this weight is pressing on the ground and its pillars, causing it to slowly collapse. Even after all this, the protagonist says that the repair can be postponed and that building the bridge is more urgent. The queen realizes he knew what she was thinking and still gave a different answer, while the protagonist knows that she knows he gave a different answer. The queen, like a lion ablaze, shows her power, while Lloyd is like a puppy chasing after a construction contract. He says the current Magenta River Bridge has been rebuilt 20 times and regularly collapses due to not withstanding the rising waters in spring, asking for Majesty's trust to build a new bridge that will never collapse, clearly referring to a modern suspension bridge. Seeing that the man in front of her just criticized her decision, the queen starts to like him and asks to hear more about this bridge. Majesty took the bait, and Lloyd lets out his demonic laugh. He knew from the start that the queen despised sycophants and placed trust in those who were strong in their words. However, eventually, she will be betrayed by someone she trusts and will lose one of her arms, becoming the assassin tyrant, but that's a story 3 years in the future. The queen asks what he will do if the bridge collapses. In his mind, Lloyd would pack his things and leave the country, but he ends up betting his head on it. In return, as long as his bridge stands, he would like to secure a position for his family. The redhead, who hadn't shown anything until now, gives a small smile and accepts the proposal to build a bridge. Lloyd reaches into his pocket and pulls out a contract. The queen asks if he doesn't trust his words and is impressed that he prepared a contract in such a short time. Humbly, the protagonist says that this contract states if he doesn't build a bridge honestly, she can do whatever she wants with him, thinking of it as a loyalty contract from a humble man to Her Majesty. The queen ends up signing the contract and finds it strange that she was led to do so, but she doesn't mind. As a gesture of gratitude, the protagonist raises his but while holding the contract. Walking through the palace following the butler, Lloyd twirls and shows off the contract he managed to get from the queen. Javier asks him to be a bit more careful, since she could have taken his head if she wanted. The man next to the queen says that he is quite intelligent. She really thinks he's more cunning than she imagined. When Kyler asks if she wasn't displeased since he knew from the start that he could defeat her, the queen says no, as he seemed pathetic and adorable. A few days later, Lloyd prepares to leave with a large bag on his back. Javier asks if it's okay to go alone, but the protagonist says it's even better without him, since his presence alone attracts all the women in the region. Before heading to the royal city, his mother asked him to deliver a bag full of blankets and clothes to his younger brother, Julian. As he goes to him, the protagonist tries to remember what happens in the novel. At this point in the story, the Baron had already lost everything, and his younger brother was probably expelled from school and died wandering a back alley at night. Lloyd feels incredible for saving lives and sets out to find his brother, without even knowing what he looks like. Arriving at the Royal Academy, Lloyd looks at his brother with curiosity. Even though he's the same age as Javier, he's practically a garden gnome, and the way he's looking at him makes it seem like he must have suffered at Lloyd's hands. The protagonist decides not to be too nice and acts as if he's turned the page. Maybe then Javier wouldn't suspect so much, throwing the bag full of clothes at him, saying their mother sent it. Julian finds it very strange that Lloyd didn't insult him. Moreover, he wonders if he really came there just because their mother asked. The system warns that his brother suspects his identity because he's being too kind. To try to act a little more like Lloyd, the protagonist leaves cursing at him, but Julian finds his human behavior even stranger since he left without beating him up. Before leaving, Lloyd reminds him that their mother asked him to have lunch with Javier, even though he finds it a drag. He asks if there's any fancy restaurant around. Julian questions why he's asking, and Lloyd says he'll take him to lunch since their mother asked. At the restaurant, His brother is extremely suspicious. He orders a basic set, but the protagonist tells him to choose something more expensive since he doesn't frequent these kinds of places often. Julian wonders why he's acting so normal. He used to hit him just for looking at him directly, and starts to find it even stranger when Lloyd says he quit drinking. A few days ago, someone from the palace came to say that his brother saved the city of Cremo from the Giga Titan attack. At the time, Julian thought it was an unfounded rumor or that he stole credit for something Javier did, but seeing his current behavior, it really is like he's a different person. Suddenly, Julian gets a slap on the head. The man asks what a nobody like him is doing there. Even as he tries to explain, the man keeps punching him, saying a poor baron should eat where he can't be seen. The protagonist looks around, and two students are laughing at the situation. There are even teachers and staff there, but they're just ignoring what's happening. They call it an academy, but all they really value is family status. Lloyd wonders if he should intervene, but if he did, his brother's life would only get worse in there. Then suddenly, the student beating up his brother mentions that his family has the renowned Lacona painted fabric in their title. Immediately, Lloyd associates that this young man is the son of Viscount Lacona and again makes that demonic expression, probably planning something. Lloyd approaches and asks who his father is. The blonde says it's the merciful and wise Viscount Lacona and tells him to move, getting slapped immediately afterward, losing 2 teeth. Lacona's son flies and lands at the end of the restaurant. That's the anti-horse slap. But the system says that's not an official skill. Another student yells at Lloyd, asking how he dares to touch a member of the elite union. But he also receives a slap that knocks out a tooth. Another student who is considered the best second-year fighter appears, but is neutralized with just 1 slap. Extras keep appearing. The twin brothers get beaten up at the same time, and the guy who introduced them also gets beaten up. Even the two who were just laughing at the situation against Julian get beaten up. Lacona Jr. appears behind the protagonist, punching him in the face, but immediately realizes that was the worst decision of his life as Lloyd looks at him as if he's going to kill him. He beats Lacona Jr., but before killing him, he's stopped by his brother. Julian is worried that he will be even more intimidated at school after this, but the MC says with a smile on his face that if they die, they will never bother him again. Julian is completely shocked at how he can say something like that with such a bright smile. Lloyd continues beating and thinks he's seen many guys like this in high school. The best remedy for dealing with them is the fear of death. Suddenly, soldiers appear, commanding him to stop immediately. An old man says this is the Sacred Academy and asks what he's doing. The protagonist, still holding the Viscount's son like a demon, leaves his brother scared, thinking he will try to hit the guards too. But to his surprise, his attitude changes completely, and he calmly introduces himself as the son of Baron Lloyd Frontera. He apologizes for the commotion, but says he was only defending Her Majesty's honor. The old man says this is ridiculous and asks who would dare tarnish Her Majesty's name. Lloyd says Lacona's son was intimidating his brother, and even points to a teacher who witnessed the situation. But since there was no intention to punish him, he had to intervene. The reason he didn't do anything is obvious. The staff of this academy has been bought by the nobility. There's no way the administration of the academy doesn't know what's going on, but they will just ignore these cases. The old man asks what all this has to do with Her Majesty. The protagonist says that insulting his brother is the same as insulting him and even insulting the queen since he is a royal guest. As soon as the old men see the royal symbol, they all immediately kneel before His Highness. Lloyd says they must have understood the situation and is leaving. However, the old man plans to punish Julian since the royal invitation is temporary. But when he looks at Lloyd's face, he again has that demonic expression, leaving the director totally scared. In the corridors, Julian asks where they are going. Lloyd replies that they are going to the administration office to ask for a leave for him. Obviously, he hates this situation and asks how much more he intends to ruin his life. But Lloyd responds that this place will soon not be good for studying, and he should take the opportunity to rest his mind and keep his body in shape. At the palace, Javier explains to Julian that if Lloyd has a plan for him, then he should trust it. He also explains that the plan to defeat the Giga Titan was entirely made by the young master. Furthermore, he managed to open water channels, develop quarries, and become friends with wild orcs. The brother he knew became another person. Lloyd listens to the whole conversation behind the door and is happy that Javier trusts him so much. Soon after, his illusions are shattered as they begin hurling insults at him. Julian asks if he really thinks someone can change so suddenly. Javier is sure they can't and has convinced himself that Lloyd is an imposter disguising as the young master. The protagonist is worried because he could be discovered at any second. Julian asks if they could have used black magic to do this. Javier responds that it's a possibility. He has even seen the theory in a book. Because of this, he investigated if there was any abnormal mana flow in Lloyd's body. The protagonist wonders when he did that, leaving him extremely worried about being discovered. Fortunately for him, Javier doesn't feel anything unusual in his body. Javier tells him to forget about it, saying it's just an exaggerated theory. The MC knows that Javier is probably sensing his presence behind the door. It's a way of saying he suspects his identity. Julian mentions it's the first time he's heard about the family debt. He thought only he was having difficulty with studies, but Lloyd managed to get their family out of that situation, so he deserves some credit at least. The protagonist, having just earned RP points from his brother, thinks that now Julian will be his golden goose. He enters the room calling Julian to join him. As he mentioned earlier, they will train his body with manual labor. Lloyd explains the first step in making bridge suspension cables. First, spread the clay and beat it until it becomes a 90 centimeters pizza. Then fill it with dirt and rocks and give it to the snake to eat. It will excrete the molten metal, and Podon will unite and wrap it. Then everything will be ready to make the cables. The MC hands him the shovel and says the tutorial is over. This task is crucial in construction, and if it's done wrong, the rest will be a mess. Julian asks why he's giving such an important task to him, but the reason is obvious. He's a Frontera, so he should be intelligent and responsible. Outside the palace, Lloyd knows that the modern bridge is a great idea, but even with all his knowledge, it would be impossible to make it perfectly. This means he'll need to borrow knowledge from this world. Before he can ask for anything, the master craftsman denies his request. Lloyd already knew this old man was stubborn and would only work on projects that caught his attention, so he had prepared to visit him, innocently showing the project of building a new bridge. As soon as the dwarf sees his project, he immediately tells him to wait. If he builds something like that without the exact rigidity, it will break. The MC says when the bridge collapses, everyone on it will die, and as he's decapitated, he'll scream that the culprit was the great Cortigus, who didn't help make the trusses. The dwarf asks if he's trying to threaten him, but Lloyd says it's just an appeal to the conscience of a great master. He ends up relenting and asks to see the drawings. Upon closer observation, he is fully aware that he is the only person in the kingdom capable of doing this. The protagonist continues with a killer look and says that's why he asked for his help. The dwarf says this has caught his attention and decides to help with the project. With Julian working on the cables and the royal workshop working on the trusses, the only thing left to work on is the suspension of the towers. Lloyd and Javier use a mana explosion on the ground but are suddenly stopped by nobles who accuse him of stealing the Majesty's treasure. The protagonist is obviously confused, but it seems this was planned for a long time, as they personally went to ask for a trial from the Queen. In the meeting room, the Queen orders each side to state their arguments, and the first to speak is the guild. Victor says that the Magina Bridge was built by the guild's previous leader and has stood for over 30 years. He explains that in its structure, wedge-shaped columns were made to slow down the strong water current, making it practically impossible to fall. Lloyd knows that it will eventually fall, as this is information from the novel, but he cannot reveal future events to others. Boldly, he asks the guild leader how much they were paid to say that. His scandalized reaction makes the protagonist absolutely certain that he is being paid, and he recalls that in Korea, when a politician and a businessman meet, either the politician takes money from the businessman, or the businessman bribes the politician. In this case, it's the latter option. They strip away all negotiating rights and monopolize the budget. His accusation without proof ends up irritating the Queen considerably. She says that accusing someone without proof in her presence is unacceptable, and immediately sends Lloyd to royal trial. He is tied up, and his head is placed at the Reaper's aim. The Queen says he insulted her and her vassals with lies and must restore his honor. Seeing that scene, Javier prepares to enter combat as needed. The Queen asks for their final words, and Lloyd says they must exterminate the entire bloodline of the guilty party. Javier becomes even more worried about the situation. The Queen asks her two vassals if they agree, and they fully respond that it is the right thing to do. In that situation, Javier is ready to attack, but before he does anything, the queen says they must prove the innocence of her vassals and immediately orders 4 mages to circulate the guild leader. As if he knew this would happen, Lloyd has a smile on his face. The Majesty orders the confession spell to make them tell the truth. David becomes completely desperate, asking her to wait a bit. Seeing the two hit by the spell, Lloyd starts laughing like a psychopath, and the next day, the 2 men are crucified in the public square. The protagonist made only those 2 pay for the crimes since their families did nothing wrong, thinking of himself as a good and altruistic man for doing so. As a reward for telling the truth, the queen hands over all the kingdom's workers for the bridge construction. The archmages use gravitational magic to lighten the weight of the stone blocks, making the construction extremely fast. Bangul is tasked with taking the suspension rope to the other side, using her volcanic explosion to quickly cross the river while Padong tries to hold it. Seeing this incredible construction method, Julian says his brother is amazing. Javier also thinks he is and says that even though it's his first time doing hard work, he managed to do it every day. Before, Julian couldn't learn his sword art because he had a fragile body, but looking at his body state now, that shouldn't be a problem anymore. After some time, the bridge construction is finally complete. The queen says this bridge will be called Lojavi, a blend of Lloyd and Javier's names. She also grants him the title of Master Builder, leaving the dwarf irritated as he built the entire platform. Lloyd thinks that only the commission money will be enough to clear his debts, but now he has another major obstacle. The queen is probably thinking of how to use him to her advantage. If he fails now, it will break his entire plan of becoming a wealthy and lazy lord, so he will put the plan of escaping work and helping Julian in the academy into action. Returning to the castle, the queen fulfills her part of the agreement and grants a noble title and properties to Lloyd. The castle's nobles were not pleased with this at all. The queen thinks it's natural, since he has sunk other nobles. The protagonist says he would like to ask for something a bit bigger and mentions that if she considers his request reasonable, she may even withdraw the offer of the title and property. This piques the queen's curiosity about what he will propose. Nevertheless, regardless of what the scoundrel asks for, her desire to keep him by her side will not change. The protagonist expresses a wish for a thorough cleaning of the Royal Academy, which is currently rife with corruption, inequality, and despicable behavior. Instead of studying, the students only use their status to harm those of lower rank. The teachers and supervisors are aware of this but choose to ignore it, furthering the social barrier within the institution. Both the headmistress and the nobles present are incredulous at what he has just said. Javier presents the results of a 4-month investigation conducted by Lloyd, which identifies all the corrupt nobles and workers in the academy. Upon hearing this, the nobles claim he is spreading lies and that such things couldn't happen in the Royal Academy. However, this turns out to be signing their own death warrants, as the queen orders the use of truth-telling spells on them, adding more nobles to the public lynching. Inside the academy, the queen is cleaning house with her soldiers, intending to rid her land of all the filthy rats. Lloyd watches from afar, a satisfied smile on his face. Javier asks if his smile is because the nobles are being condemned, but in reality, it's because his plan to get rid of the queen and enjoy a lazy life has worked. Suddenly, the royal bodyguard appears with a message. He can go home whenever he wants, but must attend the banquet tomorrow night. Furthermore, the queen found his plan to dodge work excellent and respects his desire to live as a slacker. Lloyd is a bit shocked to discover he has been in her palm all along. When he sees the swordsman leaving, he asks Javier if he couldn't sense him approaching. The obvious answer is no, since this man is a master swordsman. So let's go back to Lloyd's room. Julian asks if he hit Diego knowing this would happen. Basically, yes, as he already planned to investigate the academy after its construction and trusted the queen's confidence in him for it to work. Julian tells him he no longer needs to pretend to call him a little shit and now sees him as a brother he can be proud of. Lloyd is impressed by his words, but then says it was so bad it made him want to vomit. At night, the celebratory banquet finally begins. The protagonist tries to hide from the queen, but she finds him and insists he come closer. She remarks that hiding like this makes him look like a mole cricket, with Javier fully agreeing and stating he definitely looks like one. Lloyd is annoyed that Javier seems relieved, while the queen again orders him to come closer. The protagonist apologizes and approaches a bit, but the queen insists he come even closer, making Lloyd increasingly uncomfortable. She leans in and whispers that if he changes his mind, he can come see her anytime. This excites our mercenary. As much as lazing about is good, he now has a nest to return to whenever he needs money. As he eats, happy with the new development, he remembers that in 3 years, the queen will become a villain, causing his nest and properties to vanish. It's at this moment that Lloyd hears Kyle say the banquet will continue until sunrise, reminding the protagonist exactly what that phrase means. It's the secret code used by those planning to assassinate the Majesty. The problem is, this was supposed to happen in 3 years. And also, why is the secret code to assassinate the queen coming from the royal guard? A while later, she finds herself in her quarters. The queen looks tired and wonders if she drank too much, but she thinks it must be because she's been working hard in recent days. This excessive work is due to Asfahan, an enemy state where King Samarkand has been amassing an army. But it's probably not for an invasion, since trying to invade through the jungle would be a suicide mission. At that moment, the queen feels a strong headache. She finds it strange, since the effects of alcohol should be neutralized by the mana in her body. Soon after, it becomes difficult to control her heartbeat and breathing. She tries to circulate mana to neutralize the effects, but a sharp pain hits her heart, preventing her from circulating mana throughout her body. The queen has no doubt it's poison and tries to walk to the door, calling for help from anyone who might be there. The front door begins to open, and her knight Kyle appears. The queen says he arrived just in time and that she needs his help, but the help Kyle offers is different, leaving the queen incredulous at the betrayal. Meanwhile, Lloyd, still at the banquet, tells Javier that they have a problem. The swordsman simply starts following him without asking anything, surprising Lloyd that he doesn't inquire about what's happening. He asks if Javier can knock out a master swordsman. Javier knows he's not joking but asks for some sense, and says he'll try to stop him for a maximum of 3 minutes. Turning the corner, they come across a pile of bodies. Inside the room, Kyle does his best to kill the queen, but even poisoned, she manages to defend herself. She asks why he's doing this and receives a kick to the stomach. Kyle prepares for a final attack but is stopped by Javier, who approaches quickly. Not giving him time to react, Kyle attacks, but our swordsman manages to defend, surprising Kyle as he stopped his sword using a candelabra. Taking advantage of the distraction of the battle, Lloyd approaches the queen, covering her mouth before she says anything and using the core technique to absorb the poison. Javier continues buying time, but Kyle is not playing around and activates the sword's aura. Realizing that if he completes that, they're in trouble, Javier throws the candelabra, interrupting the aura formation. He catches the candelabra back in the air and uses blessed mana to attack, impressing Kyle with his mana talent. However, he still lacks experience in real combat, and Kyle takes the opportunity to strike while Javier is in the air, cutting his candelabra and his chest. Lloyd continues absorbing the poison mana. The only thing he can do at this moment is pray for Javier to win, or everyone there will die. Kyle knows his cut was superficial but takes the moment to land another blow. However, our lunatic swordsman isn't afraid of death and charges forward, dodging the strike at the last second. Javier shouts the name Padon, who tosses a sword towards him. With the blade in hand, he's perfectly ready to face a master swordsman. Javier uses blessed mana again, directing the explosion at Kyle. Kyler manages to defend but is thrown back by the impact, stunned and scared, wondering how Javier can wield the power of a cannon. Before he can think, another mana blast heads his way, but this time he manages to dodge. Javier decides to attack from all sides, dividing the blessed mana into multiple explosions, making a master swordsman run in fear. Meanwhile, Lloyd continues the process of absorbing the poison. The queen wonders how this is possible. He's only absorbing the mana contaminated by the poison. But before she can ask where he learned this ability, our protagonist tells her to shut up, angering Her Majesty as he just reprimanded her. But seeing Lloyd spit blood, she wonders if he's trying to sacrifice himself to save her. In the banquet hall, a huge explosion is seen as Kyle is thrown back, watching Javier advance slowly. The master swordsman realizes he can't handle him alone and shouts to the guards that Javier is an intruder who tried to assassinate the queen. With a single sword swing, our mini-monster sends several elite guards flying back and, concentrating a bit of mana, causes an explosion to keep them at bay. Kyle has never heard of a man who could do something like this in history and is scared at the possibility of him becoming a sword master. However, that won't happen as he will personally ensure Javier is eliminated. Seeing the sword's aura, Javier knows he's in trouble. Just swinging his sword makes the ground stones float. Shortly after, Javier is thrown away by the aura, heavily injured, as Kyle approaches to finish him off. At that moment, the protagonist finishes absorbing all the poison, but it's too much for his body to handle. He starts vomiting black blood, and the queen says he will die like this, instructing to gather all the mana in his arm. However, our mole man refuses to lose an arm as it will make digging harder. Lloyd grabs a butter knife and activates Mana Blast using all his mana, expelling the poison all at once. The explosion is so massive that it destroys part of the castle, leaving Kyle questioning where all this power came from. But before he can dwell on it too much, Javier rises, ready for the second round. He made a vow to Lloyd, and he needs to keep that vow alive. Before reaching the royal capital, Javier admits he was hopeless from start to finish. He was supposed to be Lloyd's guard, but he abandoned his duty and ran to the gigantic titan. Because of this and his lack of strength, he no longer feels capable of fulfilling his duties as a knight. Lloyd tells him not to worry too much, as he'll deduct 6 months from his salary, leaving Javier impressed with his lack of shame. Perhaps this shamelessness of his master is rubbing off on the swordsman, as he tries to negotiate the salary deduction down to 3 months. He promises to become a sword master in a year, but the protagonist remarks that these are quite ambitious words for someone who couldn't keep the promise of losing 10 pounds. Nevertheless, Lloyd decides to help him, explaining the concept behind becoming a sword master. Before finishing the explanation, Javier interrupts, saying he'd like to do it without his help. He advances determinedly but is impaled by Kyle, who is surprised that he survived. Most people would have been torn apart as soon as they were hit by the aura, but our prodigy concentrated all his mana into one point to strengthen it. Kyle would like to see more of his tricks, but he's running out of time. At this moment, Javier starts to catch fire but still manages to hold onto Kyle's hands, preventing him from escaping. The aura is burning his body, but while holding Kyle's hand, he manages to absorb the aura directly from the mana heart. Realizing the danger, Kyle throws Javier away, who simply falls to the ground without showing any signs of life. Even the master swordsman can't detect any breath from him. As Kyle has already wasted too much time, he moves to take the queen's head but is stopped by Javier, who rises unexpectedly. Javier says he now understands mana and activates the aura, creating a new sword blade. Kyle is at a loss for words. In all his life, he has never seen such a cursed brat. Javier further increases the aura of the sword, making it giant and attacking immediately. The swordsman tries to defend, but the power of his aura is completely overwhelmed, and his arm is severed. He screams in pain as the other guards approach. Javier orders everyone to retreat, warning that they cannot face the sword master. In the room, the queen is worried about Lloyd, who shows no sign of life. The protagonist slowly wakes up and discovers that he is now immune to poison and can absorb mana from the environment. He is quite happy since these seem to be great, but due to his creepy face, the queen reflexively punches him. He is confused about being hit out of nowhere, and even the queen cannot explain why she did it. She just says that when she saw his face, she felt like hitting him. Putting that aside, she asks if he is okay and can stand up, but that massive surge of mana left the protagonist incapacitated. As the only option, he uses his new ability to absorb the mana from the environment, even drawing mana from the queen who is nearby. She is frightened by this ridiculous absorption power, and tries to get the MC's attention, but he does not seem to hear anything. The queen simply accepts it, saying he can take all the mana he needs and go help his knight. After a few minutes, he finally manages to restore all his energy. Lloyd feels his body much lighter, probably now fully restored, but before celebrating, he remembers he needs to help Javier. When he turns towards the queen, he sees she is completely out of mana. Magenta says she will ask for details later. The priority now is to stop Kyle. The protagonist puts her on his back and heads towards Javier. The queen knows he is strong, yet it is not enough to face a sword master, or so she thought. As soon as they turn the corner, they see Javier facing the guards. At that moment, the protagonist notices the sword aura and Kyle on the ground, groaning in pain. The queen orders the guards to lower their weapons and explains that these were the two heroes who protected her from her guards' betrayal. All the guards line up as the queen states that everyone who attended the banquet must be investigated. Lloyd asks if he really became the sword master. Javier casually says yes, as his master keeps putting himself in dangerous situations. This is his way of fulfilling his duty. Due to all his incredible achievements, the system activates a new function called the praise system. Whenever he does something fantastic, he earns a title, and this title comes with an ability, but he did not expect the boost from the ability to be so great. The system also gives CP, but Lloyd has to beg the system to tell him how to use it, discovering that this CP is used to see a final spoiler. Returning to the room, Lloyd complains of exhaustion, having been unable to sleep the previous night due to the investigation. Julian asks if they found the culprit behind the plan, but Lloyd explains that they used some barrier that prevents the truth spell. Because of this, he will have to stay a little longer in the royal capital since the novel had no information about the murder, besides these events being supposed to happen in 3 years. Julian asks if Javier is still under investigation, discovering that the queen summoned him separately since he became a sword master. Julian didn't know Javier had evolved and is extremely surprised, but Lloyd explains that this is just common thinking, as he was the one who defeated Lord Kyle. At that moment, we see Her Majesty thanking our swordsman for his deeds, offering him a position as a royal knight, since a vacancy has opened up. Julian is worried that Javier might leave them, but Lloyd warns that he really doesn't know the swordsman from the Frontera's family. Javier explains that he is a knight of Baron Frontera and wishes to continue by Lloyd's side. The queen states that this is not a request but an order. Refusing an order from the queen is equivalent to treason. Our honorable knight only asks for permission to send a farewell letter to his baron, making the queen realize that he would rather die than serve her. Understanding that she won't be able to have Javier by her side, she allows him to remain a knight of the Fronteras. Javier thanks her for her mercy and heads towards the exit. He meets Julian, who asks if he will leave the family, but Javier asks him not to worry because he will continue to be their knight. The queen realizes she truly isn't lucky with people from the Frontera's property. Finally, night falls, and Lloyd is lying on the grass, checking the abilities that titles offer. Many of his great achievements have earned him titles, and his most recent one was gaining the queen's trust. All these titles grant CP, character points, but they are only counted in the system once a month on the full moon. Seeing the moon shining in the night sky, the CP is finally accumulated, and he decides to see a final spoiler. As he activates the ability, the space around him becomes dark, until suddenly the darkness is replaced by flames. Walking a bit, he realizes he's at the Frontera's property, but the beautiful place is completely destroyed, and people are dead. Lloyd starts running, asking what kind of ending this is, trying to get any information from the system, but what he finds further ahead leaves his mind completely disturbed. The protagonist sees Lloyd and Javier staring at two bodies on the ground, immediately recognizing them as the Baron and Baroness. Illusion Lloyd is desperate, apologizing for not being able to protect anyone, making the protagonist even angrier with this ending. Suddenly, he hears a noise coming from behind, and when he turns, he is faced with a swarm of insects.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on upcoming videos. Leave a like if you enjoyed it and share with your friends. See you in the next video. Bye for now.